Welcome back to Horror Stories. Tonight's Scary Stories for Sleep tale is perfect for those who like to fall asleep to our scary stories. We're happy to be your creepy bedtime companion as you drift off to sleep. Before you close your eyes, we want to ask, what number scares you and why? Last week's answers were really interesting. Think you can top them? Tell us about your scary numbers in the comments below. For the best experience, use headphones. As you get comfy, remember, our stories might follow you into your dreams. If you're enjoying our nightly stories, please like and subscribe. This way you won't miss any of our scary bedtime tales. Now get ready. In our stories, sleep and nightmares are very close. Sweet dreams, if you can have them. And we hope your unlucky number stays away from tonight's scares. I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my eyes. The soft morning light filtering through the curtains was familiar, but the weight beside me in bed was not. I turned my head, heart racing, to find a stranger sleeping peacefully next to me. A woman with long dark hair splayed across the pillow. My wife had short blonde hair. At least she did yesterday. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the stranger who should be my wife, and made my way to the bathroom. The face staring back at me from the mirror was my own, but somehow different. Older, perhaps. The crow's feet around my eyes seemed more pronounced, and there was a small scar on my chin that I didn't remember. As I splashed water on my face, trying to wake myself from what surely must be a dream, I heard a child's voice from down the hall. "Daddy, are you up?" I froze. We didn't have children. Stepping out of the bathroom, I found myself face to face with a little girl, no more than 6 years old. She looked up at me with familiar green eyes, my eyes, set in a face that was the spitting image of the woman in my bed. "Morning, sweetie," I managed to say, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. She giggled and grabbed my hand, pulling me towards the stairs. "Come on, Daddy. You promised we'd make pancakes before Aunt Sarah arrives." Aunt Sarah. The name struck a chord deep within me, triggering a cascade of memories that didn't belong to me. Sarah, my sister. My little sister who died when we were kids. Except, she hadn't. In this reality, Sarah was very much alive and coming to visit. I allowed myself to be led downstairs, my mind reeling. The house was the same, yet subtly different. Family photos adorned the walls, showing a life I didn't recognize. There I was, arm around the dark-haired woman, beaming at the camera. And there was Sarah, older now, but unmistakably the sister I thought I'd lost decades ago. As I mechanically went through the motions of making pancakes with my apparent daughter, my thoughts raced. How was this possible? Had I woken up in some parallel universe? Or had I finally lost my mind? The woman from the bed, my wife in this reality, came downstairs, greeting us with a sleepy smile. "Morning, loves," she said, kissing the top of our daughter's head before pressing her lips to mine. The familiar gesture from an unfamiliar person sent a shiver down my spine. "You okay, babe?" she asked, noticing my discomfort. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only she knew. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a weird dream." As we sat down to breakfast, I tried to piece together this new life. My wife's name was Emily. Our daughter was called Lily. We'd been married for 8 years, and Sarah, my very much alive sister, was coming to stay with us for a week. The doorbell rang just as we were finishing up. Lily jumped up, excitement radiating from her small frame. "Aunt Sarah's here." I stood, my legs feeling like lead as I made my way to the front door. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob, and there she was. Sarah. Older, yes, but with the same mischievous twinkle in her eye that I remembered from childhood. "Hey, big brother," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Long time no see." I hugged her back, inhaling the scent of her perfume, the same one she used to steal from our mother's dresser. Tears pricked at my eyes as I held her, memories of a shared childhood we never had, flooding my mind. As the day wore on, I found myself slipping into the role of this alternate version of myself. I laughed at inside jokes I shouldn't know, reminisced about events I'd never experienced, and felt a deep love for the family I'd woken up to. But underneath it all, a nagging doubt persisted. This wasn't my life. These weren't my memories. The real me had lost Sarah, had married a different woman, had chosen a different path. Hadn't I? That night, after Sarah had gone to bed in the guest room and Lily was tucked in with a bedtime story, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching Emily as she read a book. "Em," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever feel like this isn't the life you were supposed to have?" She looked up, her brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean?" I struggled to find the words. "Like you woke up one day and everything was different, like you're living someone else's life." Emily set her book aside and took my hand in hers. "Honey, is this about the accident? Dr. Patel said you might experience some disorientation, remember?" "Accident? Dr. Patel?" I blinked, new memories surfacing. A car crash, a head injury, weeks in the hospital. I think I need some air," I mumbled, standing up abruptly. I made my way outside, the cool night air a welcome relief. As I stared up at the stars, I tried to reconcile the two sets of memories warring in my head. Which was real? The life where I'd lost Sarah and married someone else? Or this one, where my sister lived and I had a family I adored? A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" I turned to see Sarah standing there, wrapped in a robe, looking just as real and solid as the ground beneath my feet. "Sarah," I breathed, "I need to ask you something, and it's gonna sound crazy." She smiled, that familiar, understanding smile that I'd missed for so long. "Crazier than you forgetting your entire life after a car accident? Try me." I took a deep breath. Do you remember dying? When we were kids?" Sarah's smile faltered for a moment, then returned. Sadder this time. "Oh, Jack, is that what you've been dreaming about? Dr. Patel warned us you might have some false memories." She stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "I didn't die, big brother. I'm right here. I've always been here." As I looked into her eyes, I felt something shift inside me. The memories of a life without Sarah began to fade, like a dream upon waking. This life, this family, this reality began to solidify, becoming more real with each passing second. "Yeah," I said, pulling her into a hug. "You have always been here." I don't know what I was thinking. As we stood there under the stars, I felt the last vestiges of that other life slip away. By morning I knew it would be gone entirely, leaving only the faintest sense that something, somewhere, had changed. But for now, in this moment, with my sister in my arms and my family sleeping soundly inside, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And if this was a glitch in the Matrix, well, maybe some glitches were worth embracing. If you've made it this far, the shadows have already begun to close in. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss a terrifying tale. And if you dare, hit the thanks button to buy me a cup of midnight brew. Your support keeps the nightmares flowing. Now, brace yourself for our next story. The whispers beyond the old Ouija board lay forgotten in the attic, covered in decades of dust. I never believed in that supernatural nonsense, until the night it spelled out my dead sister's name. Sarah had been gone for 15 years, but the moment I saw those letters form on the weathered board, my world tilted on its axis. The planchette moved of its own accord, sending chills down my spine as it spelled out a message that would haunt me for weeks to come. I never left. Little did I know, those 3 words were just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume my entire existence. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Emily Thorne, and I'm a 32-year-old high school English teacher in the small town of Millbrook, nestled in the misty hills of New England. I've always been the rational one, the voice of reason among my more superstitious friends. But that night in the attic of my childhood home changed everything. It was a crisp autumn evening when I returned to Millbrook to help my aging parents sort through years of accumulated memories. My father, once a towering figure of strength, now moved with the halting gait of advancing Parkinson's. My mother, her hair more silver than brown, seemed to have shrunk in on herself since Sarah's death. "Emily, dear," Mom called from the kitchen as I lugged another box down from the attic. "Why don't you take a break? I've made some tea." I wiped the sweat from my brow, leaving a smear of dust across my forehead. "Thanks, Mom. I'll be down in a minute. I just want to go through one more box." As I turned back to the dimly lit attic, my eyes fell on a familiar shape peeking out from beneath a threadbare sheet. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the elegant curves of the Ouija board my sister and I had played with as children. I hadn't seen it since the night before Sarah disappeared. With trembling hands, I pulled the sheet away, revealing the ornate board with its alphabet, numbers, and the words yes and no in flowing script. The planchette, the heart-shaped pointer, sat innocently in the center of the board. "It's just a game," I whispered to myself, trying to quell the unease rising in my chest. A silly parlor trick. But as I reached to put the board away, a gust of wind from the small attic window sent shivers down my spine. The planchette seemed to quiver, as if alive. Before I could stop myself, I placed my fingertips lightly on the pointer. "Is anyone there?" I asked, feeling foolish even as the words left my lips. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly at first, the planchette began to move. My breath caught in my throat as it slid across the board, spelling out a name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. S-A-R-H. I jerked my hands away, my heart pounding. "This isn't funny," I said to the empty attic, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" As if in response, the planchette moved again, this time without my touch. I watched in horror as it spelled out. I never left. A scream lodged in my throat as I scrambled away from the board, nearly tumbling down the attic stairs in my haste to escape. I burst into the kitchen, startling my mother so badly she dropped her teacup, sending shards of porcelain skittering across the linoleum. "Emily, what on earth?" "The Ouija board," I gasped, pointing towards the attic. It moved on its own. It spelled out Sarah's name. My mother's face paled, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Oh, Emily, you know how your imagination can run wild. It's probably just the wind, or..." "No, Mom," I insisted, my voice rising. "I saw it. It said I never left. What if Sarah's trying to communicate with us?" The look that passed between my parents was heavy with unspoken sorrow and fear. My father cleared his throat, his voice gruff with emotion. "Emily, we've been through this. Sarah's gone. It's time to let her rest." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air in the house felt charged, as if we were on the cusp of uncovering a long-buried secret. Despite my parents' protests, I found myself drawn back to the attic that night, the Ouija board calling to me like a siren's song. As the clock struck midnight, I sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, the board balanced on my knees. My hands shook as I placed them on the planchette once more. "Sarah?" I whispered into the darkness. "Are you really here?" The pointer began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. "Help me," my breath caught in my throat. "How? How can I help you?" "Find me." "Find you? But where? We searched for months after you disappeared." The planchette moved again, spelling out words that made my blood run cold. "The lake." Images flashed through my mind, Sarah and I swimming in the murky waters of Lake Millbrook, laughing and splashing on hot summer days. But there was something else, a memory just out of reach, shrouded in fog. "What happened at the lake, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Before the planchette could move again, a loud crash from downstairs made me jump. I heard my mother's startled cry, followed by my father's concerned voice. Reluctantly, I left the board and hurried downstairs to find my dad helping my mom up from the floor. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "I just got dizzy for a moment." As I helped her to the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was trying to tell me something important. But what secrets could the placid waters of Lake Millbrook be hiding? The next morning, I woke early, determined to investigate. I told my parents I was going for a walk to clear my head, but my feet carried me straight to the shore of Lake Millbrook. The water was still in the pale light of dawn, its surface like a mirror reflecting the mist that clung to the trees. As I stood at the water's edge, memories began to surface, fragments of that last day with Sarah. We had come to the lake to swim, but something had gone wrong. There was an argument, raised voices, and then nothing. The rest was a blank. I closed my eyes, trying to force the memories to come into focus. When I opened them again, I gasped. There, just beneath the surface of the water, I saw a pale face looking back at me. Sarah's face. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. When I looked again, the face was gone, leaving only ripples on the water's surface. But I knew what I had seen. Sarah was here, trapped somehow between worlds, and she needed my help. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with uncovering the truth. I spent hours poring over old newspapers at the local library, searching for any clue about Sarah's disappearance. My parents watched me with growing concern, but I couldn't stop, not when I was so close to answers. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I came across a small article buried in the back pages of a 15-year-old newspaper. The headline read, "Local man arrested in connection with teen's disappearance." My heart pounded as I read the details. A man named Frank Holloway had been questioned about Sarah's disappearance, but was released due to lack of evidence. The article mentioned that Holloway owned a cabin near Lake Millbrook. That night, I returned to the Ouija board, my mind racing with possibilities. "Sarah," I called out, "do you know Frank Holloway?" The planchette moved swiftly, spelling out a chilling response. "He took me." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. "Is he the one who killed you?" Tears stung my eyes as the reality of what had happened to my sister began to sink in. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have protected you." The planchette moved again, more gently this time. "Not your fault, but I couldn't shake the guilt that had plagued me for 15 years. I'll make this right," I promised. "I'll find a way to bring you justice." As if in response to my words, a gust of wind blew through the attic, extinguishing the candle I had lit. In the sudden darkness, I felt a presence, not malevolent, but sad and yearning. For a moment, I could have sworn I felt Sarah's hand on my shoulder, comforting me as she had done so many times when we were children. The next day, I drove out to the address listed for Frank Holloway's cabin. The place was run down, clearly abandoned for years. As I approached the dilapidated structure, a sense of foreboding washed over me. I knew I was close to uncovering the truth, but at what cost? I picked the lock on the cabin door, a skill I never thought I'd need, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. Cobwebs clung to every surface, and the floorboards creaked ominously under my feet. As I searched the cabin, my flashlight beam fell upon a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug. My heart raced as I pulled it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. With shaking hands, I descended into the cellar. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, revealing shelves lined with jars of murky liquid. And there, in the center of the room, was a large metal trunk. I approached it slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. As I lifted the lid, a wave of decay hit me, nearly making me retch. And there, nestled among rotting fabric, were human bones. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I had found Sarah, but not in the way I had hoped. As I turned to flee, my elbow knocked against one of the shelves, sending jars crashing to the floor. The sickly sweet smell of formaldehyde filled the air as I raced up the stairs and out of the cabin. I don't remember much of the drive back into town, but I found myself at the police station, babbling about Sarah and Frank Holloway and the horrors I had discovered in that cellar. The officers were skeptical at first, but something in my eyes must have convinced them. They sent a team out to the cabin, and within hours, Frank Holloway was in custody. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, tearful conversations with my parents, and a media frenzy that descended upon our small town. But through it all, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in 15 years. Sarah had been found, and her killer would face justice. It was late one night, about a week after Holloway's arrest, that I found myself drawn once more to the Ouija board in the attic. As I placed my hands on the planchette, I felt a familiar presence. "Sarah?" I whispered. "Are you still here?" The pointer moved, spelling out words that brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you. I can rest now." "I love you, Sarah," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "I'll never forget you. I love you too. Goodbye." As the planchette stilled, I felt a warmth envelop me, like a final embrace. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I knew, deep in my heart, that Sarah had finally found peace. In the years that followed, I often thought about those terrifying days when the veil between worlds seemed to lift. The Ouija board remained in the attic, a silent reminder of the power of love and the enduring connection between sisters. Some nights, when the wind whispers through the trees and the moon casts long shadows across my bedroom floor, I swear I can still hear Sarah's laughter echoing from the attic. And though it sends a shiver down my spine, I smile. For I know now that death is not the end, and that some bonds transcend even the greatest of mysteries. As for me, I've learned to live with one foot in two worlds: the rational, daylight world of lesson plans and faculty meetings, and the shadowy realm of spirits and unfinished business. I've come to understand that there are more things in heaven and earth than I ever dreamed possible. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, I find myself climbing those creaky attic stairs, drawn by an unseen force to that old Ouija board. I never know what messages might come through, what secrets might be revealed, but I do know one thing for certain: I'll always be listening for the whispers from beyond. I never wanted to work the night shift at Millbrook Hospital, but when you're a single mom with bills to pay, you take what you can get. I told myself it was just like any other job: clock in, make my rounds, clock out. I had no idea those quiet, sterile halls would become my own personal hell. It started small. You know how hospitals are at night. Every little sound seems amplified. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft beep of distant monitors, the squeak of your shoes on the freshly polished floors. But there was something else. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I'd turned my head thinking a patient was calling out, but there was never anyone there. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination at first. Night shift does that to you, plays tricks on your mind when the world goes still and dark. But then I started noticing other things. Items moved from where I'd left them. Wheelchair tracks on floors I'd just mopped. And always that feeling of being watched. My coworkers brushed off my concerns. It's an old building, they'd say. Pipes settling, that's all. But they didn't have to walk those long, empty corridors alone at 3 a.m. They didn't see the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, always just at the corner of your eye. It was on my third week that I met Mrs. Holloway. She was a sweet old lady, admitted for pneumonia, frail as a bird, with wispy white hair and eyes that had seen too much. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard her calling out, "Nurse? Nurse, please." Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. I hurried into her room, ready to fetch water or adjust her pillows. But Mrs. Holloway wasn't looking at me. Her roomy eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, a mixture of fear and wonder on her face. "Mrs. Holloway, what is it? What do you need?" She turned to me then, her papery hand reaching out to grasp mine with surprising strength. "You see them too, don't you, dear? The ones who don't belong." A chill ran down my spine. I don't know what you mean." Mrs. Holloway's grip tightened. "Oh, you do, I can tell. They're always watching, always waiting. They don't like it when we notice them." I tried to soothe her, to tell her it was just a bad dream. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in that far corner. Just for a second, I could have sworn I saw a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. When I blinked, it was gone. From that night on, things escalated. The whispers became louder, more insistent. I'd hear my name called out in the empty cafeteria, or feel a cold breath on the back of my neck as I restocked supply closets. Doors would slam shut behind me, and more than once I found myself locked in rooms that shouldn't have had locks at all. I tried to switch shifts, but my supervisor wouldn't hear of it. "You're one of our best night nurses," she said. "The patients feel safe with you." If only she knew how unsafe I felt. It was about a month later when I had my worst experience. I was making my final rounds before dawn, counting the minutes until I could leave. As I passed by the long-term care ward, I heard it. A low, guttural moan that made every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't human, couldn't be human. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I approached the ward. The sound grew louder, interspersed with a wet, squelching noise that turned my stomach. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. The door swung open silently, revealing a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my days. The ward was filled with shapes, dark, writhing masses that seemed to suck in all the light around them. They crowded around the beds, long, spindly appendages reaching out to touch the sleeping patients. And the noise, that horrible, hungry noise, was coming from them. I must have made a sound, a gasp or a whimper, because suddenly every one of those things turned to look at me. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see anything resembling a face, but I felt the weight of their attention like a physical blow. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, as one, they began to glide towards me. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, down those endless corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear them behind me, that wet, slithering sound growing closer and closer. I didn't stop when I reached the parking lot. Didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. I never went back to Millbrook Hospital. I called in my resignation the next day, citing family emergency. My supervisor was disappointed, said the patients would miss me. I wonder sometimes if she ever worked a night shift, if she ever saw what really happens in that place after dark. I have a day job now, at a small clinic across town. The pay isn't as good, but I sleep better at night. Well, most nights. Because sometimes, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I hear that whisper again, and I wonder, did I really leave it all behind, or did some of it follow me home? You might think this is just a story, a tale to scare you on a dark night. I wish it was, but every word is true. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift in an old hospital, remember my warning. Watch the shadows, listen for the whispers, and whatever you do, don't let them know you can see them. Because once they know you're aware, they'll never leave you alone. The night shift at Millbrook Hospital taught me one thing. Sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones under our beds or in our closets. Sometimes they're the ones walking the halls of the places we go to heal, waiting for the lights to go out and the world to go quiet. And when they find you, when they realize you can see them, well, let's just say there are fates worse than death. Much, much worse. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought I was losing my mind. Working the night shift at Millbrook Hospital's morgue was never going to be a cheery job. But after 3 years, I thought I'd seen it all. Bodies mangled in car crashes, victims of violent crimes, the occasional suicide. They were all just part of the job. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in August. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I clocked in at 11 p.m. The day shift guy, Mike, was eager to leave as usual. "All yours, Sarah," he said with a forced smile. "Just one new arrival. Jane Doe in drawer 23. Cops found her in the river this morning." I nodded, used to his brief handovers. "Thanks, Mike. Have a good night." As the heavy door clicked shut behind him, I settled into my routine. Check the coolers, update the logs, prepare for any potential new arrivals. The morgue was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigeration units. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take a closer look at our Jane Doe. I pulled out drawer 23 and unzipped the body bag. The woman looked to be in her mid-30s, with long dark hair plastered to her pale skin. Drowning victim, most likely. But something about her face made me uneasy. Her eyes were closed, but her lips were parted slightly, as if she'd been about to speak when death took her. I shook off the feeling and began the external examination, jotting down notes for the pathologist who'd perform the autopsy in the morning. That's when I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Help me." I froze, my pen hovering over the clipboard. It had sounded so close, almost in my ear. But that was impossible. I was alone down here, wasn't I? I turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing but stainless steel and harsh fluorescent lighting. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered to myself. "You're letting this place get to you." I turned back to Jane Doe, determined to finish my work quickly. But as I leaned in to examine a peculiar mark on her neck, I heard it again. "Please, help me." This time I was sure it came from the woman on the table. But that was impossible. She was dead. I checked her vitals myself. No pulse, no respiration, body temperature consistent with the time she'd spent in the cooler. "Hello?" I said softly, feeling foolish. "Can you hear me?" Silence. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair. "You're exhausted, girl. Time for some coffee." I zipped up the body bag and pushed the drawer shut with a metallic clang. As I walked to the small break room, I could have sworn I heard a muffled sob coming from behind me. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. When my replacement arrived at 7 a.m., I practically ran out of there. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Lack of sleep, an overly active imagination, the stress of the job, there were plenty of rational explanations. By the time I arrived for my next shift, I'd almost succeeded in believing them. Almost. Everything seemed normal at first. Mike gave his usual curt handover. No new arrivals, nothing to report. But as soon as I was alone, the whispers started again. Help us. Let us out. We're still here. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A chorus of desperate, ethereal voices. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaking. This isn't funny. The voices grew louder, more insistent. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block them out. They seemed to be inside my head now. You can hear us. Please help us. We're trapped. Don't leave us here. I ran to the phone, my trembling fingers dialing 911. But as soon as the operator answered, the voices fell silent. 911, what's your emergency? I hesitated, suddenly unsure of myself. I'm sorry. I think it was a mistake. I'm fine. I hung up, my mind racing. What the hell was happening to me? Over the next few weeks, the phenomena continued. Some nights were quiet, almost normal. Others were filled with whispers, sobs, and once, a blood-curdling scream that sent me running from the building. I started to dread going to work, but I couldn't bring myself to quit or tell anyone what was happening. Who would believe me? Then came the night that changed everything. It was a busy shift. A multi-car pileup on the highway had filled our coolers to capacity. I was run off my feet, processing new arrivals and managing paperwork. It wasn't until well past midnight that I noticed something was off. The smell hit me first. A sickly sweet odor that cut through the usual clinical scents of the morgue. I frowned, following my nose to cooler number 3. With a growing sense of dread, I pulled open the door. The stench that rushed out nearly knocked me off my feet. Gagging, I pulled out the drawer to find a body in an advanced state of decomposition. But that was impossible. This man had been brought in just hours ago, a victim of the car crash. As I stared in horror, his eyes snapped open. They were cloudy, unseeing, but fixed directly on me. His bloated, discolored lips parted. Why did you leave us here? The voice was a rasp, barely human. We're still alive. I stumbled backward, slamming into the opposite wall. My legs gave out, and I slid to the floor, unable to tear my eyes away from the impossible sight before me. All around me, the cooler doors began to rattle. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of pleas and accusations. You knew we were here. Why didn't you help us? Don't let us die again. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. You're not real, I whimpered. You're not real. You're not real. But the voices didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. I could feel cold hands grabbing at me, pulling at my clothes, my hair. I don't know how long I sat there, curled into a ball on the floor. It could have been minutes or hours. When I finally found the courage to open my eyes, the morgue was silent and still. The body in drawer 3 was just as it should be, recently deceased, no signs of decomposition. All the coolers were tightly shut. I'd like to say I quit my job that night, that I ran from that place and never looked back. But the truth is, I'm still here, because now I know the truth. Sometimes death is not the end. Sometimes the dead have things they need to say, and someone needs to be here to listen. So I come back, night after night. I've learned to live with the whispers, the pleas, the occasional scream, because what terrifies me more than anything is the thought of what might happen if I don't. If you find yourself working the night shift in a quiet place where the line between life and death blurs, listen carefully. You might hear them too. And if you do, remember, they're not just voices in your head. They're real, and they need our help. The Skeptic's Seance. I never believed in ghosts, demons, or any of that supernatural nonsense. As a psychology major, I prided myself on my rational mind and my ability to explain away the unexplainable. That's why, when Marcus suggested we use a Ouija board at his Halloween party, I couldn't resist the opportunity to prove it was all just ideomotor responses and confirmation bias. Come on, Evelyn, Marcus said, his warm smile gleaming in the dim light of his cramped dorm room. Where's your sense of adventure? I rolled my eyes, tucking a wild strand of curly hair behind my ear. My sense of adventure is just fine, thank you. I just prefer my thrills to be based in reality. Despite my protests, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of eager faces. The planchette felt cool beneath my fingertips as we all placed our hands on it. "Oh, mighty spirits!" Marcus intoned dramatically, earning a few nervous giggles from the group. "We humbly ask you to communicate with us." I bit back a sarcastic comment, determined to play along and then explain how it all worked afterward. But as the planchette began to move, spelling out coherent responses to our questions, I felt an unsettling chill creep up my spine. The board spelled out, "Hello, Evelyn," and then "We've been waiting." I jerked my hands away, heart pounding. "Very funny, guys. Who's moving it?" The room had grown noticeably colder, and the flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the walls. My friends' faces were pale, their eyes wide with genuine fear. "Nobody's moving it, Ev," Marcus whispered. "I swear." I shook my head, refusing to accept what was happening. "This is ridiculous. It's just the power of suggestion and unconscious muscle movements. I'll prove it." Placing my fingers back on the planchette, I closed my eyes. "Spirit, if you're real, tell me something only I would know." The silence was deafening as we waited. Then, slowly but deliberately, the planchette moved. "We know about the scars." My blood turned to ice. The cutting had been my darkest secret, something I'd never told a soul. I scrambled backward, knocking over a candle in my haste to get away from the board. "This isn't funny anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "Who told you about that?" But the looks of confusion and concern on my friends' faces told me they had no idea what the message meant. As Marcus moved to comfort me, the lights flickered violently, and a gust of wind extinguished every candle, plunging us into darkness. In that moment of pitch blackness, I felt a presence, ancient, malevolent, and hungry. And I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that we had opened a door that should have remained closed. The weeks following that night were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to find some logical explanation, but the events that followed defied all reason. It started small. Objects not where I'd left them, whispers in empty rooms. I blamed it on stress and lack of sleep. But as time went on, things escalated. My roommate complained of cold spots and strange noises when I was around. Friends said I'd have conversations with them that I couldn't remember. I threw myself into my studies, hoping that by focusing on the rational world of academia, I could banish the creeping dread that followed me like a shadow. But even there, I found no respite. One night, as I pored over my textbooks in the library, the words began to swim before my eyes. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and when I looked down again, the text had changed. Where there had been paragraphs on cognitive biases, there were now strange symbols and a single phrase repeated over and over. "Let us in." I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. This was impossible. Books didn't just change their content. I was hallucinating, I had to be. The lack of sleep, the stress, it was all catching up to me. As I gathered my things to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, expecting to see another student, but instead I saw myself. Not as a reflection, but as if I were standing across the room, watching me with a cold, predatory smile. I blinked, and my doppelganger was gone. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered. The next day, I reluctantly went to see Dr. Blackwood, my psychology professor. As I sat in her office, fidgeting with the hem of my sweater, I could feel her stern gaze analyzing my every move. "Evelyn," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You've always been one of my brightest students, but lately your work has been concerning." She slid a paper across her desk. I recognized it as the essay I'd submitted last week, but as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. The neat, academic prose I remembered writing had been replaced by page after page of a single sentence. "The door is open, and we are coming through." "I didn't write this," I whispered, my hands shaking. "I swear, Dr. Blackwood, I don't know how this happened." She leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Curiosity? "Evelyn, I think it's time you told me exactly what's been going on." As I recounted the events of the past few weeks, Dr. Blackwood's expression grew increasingly troubled. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I've spent my career studying the human mind," she said finally. "I've always believed there was a rational explanation for everything. But what you're describing..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I think you need help, Evelyn. Help that I'm not qualified to give." As I left her office, I felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone finally believed me, and terror at the implication that what was happening to me was beyond the realm of conventional psychology. That night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, I heard a familiar voice call out to me. "Evelyn," it whispered, "we need to talk." I opened my eyes to see Marcus standing by my bed, his face pale in the moonlight. But something was wrong. His usually warm eyes were cold, lifeless. "Marcus," I said, sitting up, "what are you doing here? How did you get in?" He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was cruel, twisted. "Oh, Evelyn," he said, his voice overlaid with others. "We've always been here. You let us in, remember?" As I watched in horror, Marcus's form began to shift and distort, revealing the true nature of the entity that had been haunting me all along. In that moment, I realized the terrifying truth. I had never been the skeptic trying to disprove the supernatural. I had been the vessel, the doorway, through which something ancient and evil had entered our world. And now, as the creature that wore Marcus's face reached for me, I knew that my fight for control was only beginning. The campus chapel stood silent and imposing in the moonlight, its Gothic architecture a stark contrast to the modern buildings surrounding it. As I approached, flanked by Marcus and Dr. Blackwood, I could feel the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me. "Are you sure about this, Evelyn?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. "Maybe we should wait, get more help." I shook my head, my wild curls bouncing with the movement. "We can't wait. Whatever this thing is, it's getting stronger. We have to end it now." Dr. Blackwood nodded grimly. "Evelyn's right. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes, for her and for everyone around her." As we entered the chapel, the air grew thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push us back. We made our way to the altar, where we had laid out the Ouija board, the same one that had started this nightmare weeks ago. "Remember," Dr. Blackwood said as we sat around the board, "no matter what happens, we must not break the circle. If this entity is as powerful as we fear, our combined will might be the only thing strong enough to banish it." I placed my trembling fingers on the planchette, acutely aware of the darkness gathering at the edges of my vision. As Marcus and Dr. Blackwood joined me, I felt a surge of energy course through my body. "Spirit," I began, my voice stronger than I felt, "we demand that you identify yourself and state your purpose." The planchette moved with a violence I had never experienced before, nearly pulling my fingers off as it spelled out its chilling message. "We are Legion, and we are you." A wind that shouldn't have been possible indoors whipped through the chapel, extinguishing the candles we had lit. In the sudden darkness, I heard Marcus gasp and Dr. Blackwood mutter what sounded like a prayer. "What do you mean? You are me," I demanded, fighting to keep my hand on the planchette. "Foolish girl," the board spelled out. "Your skepticism was our greatest weapon. Through you, we have grown strong." Realization dawned on me, bringing with it a wave of nausea. Every time I had dismissed the strange occurrences, every time I had convinced my friends it was all in their heads, I had been playing right into the entity's hands. "No," I whispered, "that's not possible." But even as I spoke, I felt a presence stirring within me, something ancient and malevolent that had been hiding in the shadows of my mind. My vision blurred, and when it cleared, I found myself standing, looking down at my own body still seated at the Ouija board. "Evelyn?" Marcus's voice seemed to come from far away. "Evelyn, what's happening?" I tried to respond, but the words that came out were not my own. "Evelyn isn't here right now," my mouth said, in a voice that was mine and yet not mine. "We are all that remains." I watched in horror as my body moved with inhuman grace, a cruel smile twisting my features. Dr. Blackwood stood, her academic skepticism warring with the terror evident in her eyes. "Whatever you are," she said, her voice shaking, "you cannot have her. Evelyn, if you can hear me, you have to fight." Inside my mind, I screamed and raged against the entity that had taken control. I could feel its amusement at my futile efforts, its confidence that it had already won. But as I looked at Marcus and Dr. Blackwood, I saw something that the entity didn't. Unwavering belief. Not in the supernatural, but in me. And in that moment, I understood what I had to do. Summoning every ounce of will I possessed, I fought my way back into my body. It was like swimming against a riptide, every inch gained threatening to pull me under. But I persevered, clawing my way back to control. "Marcus," I gasped, my voice my own again. "The board! Destroy it!" He hesitated for just a moment before grabbing the Ouija board and smashing it against the altar. As the wood splintered, I felt the entity's grip on me weaken. "No," it shrieked, using my voice. "You cannot banish us. We are eternal." "You're wrong," I said, gritting my teeth against the pain lancing through my head. "You only have power because we give it to you, and I'm taking it back." With a final titanic effort, I pushed the entity out. The force of it sent me sprawling to the chapel floor, my ears ringing with an unearthly howl. When I opened my eyes, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. Marcus and Dr. Blackwood were kneeling beside me, their faces a mixture of concern and awe. Is it over?" Marcus asked tentatively. I sat up slowly, taking stock of my body, my mind. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly alone in my own skin. "I think so," I said, "at least for now." Dr. Blackwood helped me to my feet, her academic demeanor softened by the night's events. "Evelyn," she said, "I owe you an apology. It seems there are indeed more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy." I managed a weak smile. "I guess we all learned something tonight. Even the most hardened skeptic can be wrong." As we left the chapel, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I breathed in deeply, savoring the crisp morning air. The nightmare was over, but the borrowed voice. The Ouija board was supposed to be a joke, a silly game to play at my sister's bachelorette party. But when it spelled out, "I'm inside you," I felt something shift within me, a presence that wasn't my own. I should have known better. As a speech therapist, I understood the power of voices, but I never imagined I'd lose control of my own. My name is Olivia Chen, and this is the story of how I became a passenger in my own body. It started on a crisp October evening, the kind where the air smells of wood smoke and fallen leaves. My sister May's bachelorette party was in full swing, our rented cabin in the woods filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. As the maid of honor, I had planned everything down to the last detail, except for the Ouija board. "Come on, Liv," May's best friend Tessa called out, waving the dusty box she'd found in a closet. "Let's contact some spirits." I rolled my eyes, but couldn't help smiling at their enthusiasm. "You guys know that stuff isn't real, right?" I said, even as I helped clear the coffee table. May nudged me playfully. "Where's your sense of adventure, sis? It's just a bit of fun." If only I had known then how wrong we both were. As we gathered around the board, a hush fell over the room. The candles Tessa had insisted on lighting cast flickering shadows on the walls, turning our cozy cabin into something more ominous. "Who wants to ask the first question?" Tessa whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. May giggled, the champagne making her bold. "Oh, spirits," she intoned dramatically. "Will I have a happy marriage?" We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, trying not to laugh as it began to move. Slowly it spelled out, "Yes, if you survive." A chorus of nervous laughter erupted around the table. "Very funny, guys," May said, but I could see the hint of worry in her eyes. "My turn," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Is anyone there who'd like to speak with us?" The planchette moved again, more forcefully this time. "I'm here." A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. "And who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease growing in my stomach. The answer came swiftly, the planchette flying across the board. "I'm inside you." Before I could process what was happening, a jolt of energy surged through my body. I gasped, my back arching as if I'd been struck by lightning. For a moment, everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the floor. My friends gathered around me with worried expressions. "Liv, are you okay?" May asked, helping me sit up. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words that came out weren't my own. "I'm fine," I heard myself say, but the voice was deeper, rougher, a man's voice. "Just got a little dizzy." May's eyes widened in shock, and I clapped a hand over my mouth. What was happening to me? "I think that's enough excitement for one night," Tessa said nervously, packing away the Ouija board. "Maybe we should all get some sleep." As my friends helped me to my feet, I felt a presence stirring in the back of my mind, a consciousness that was distinctly not my own. I wanted to scream, to tell them something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't make my mouth form the words. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the cabin's wooden ceiling, I heard a voice in my head, the same voice that had come from my mouth earlier. "Hello, Olivia," it said, a hint of amusement in its tone. "I hope you don't mind if I make myself at home." I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my thoughts were the only thing still under my control. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Daniel," the voice replied, "and what I want is simple, a second chance at life." Over the next few days, I struggled to maintain control of my own body. Sometimes I was myself, able to interact normally with May and our friends. But increasingly, Daniel would take over, using my voice, my hands, my entire being as if it were his own. I watched helplessly as he used my mouth to speak, my hands to touch, my eyes to see a world he'd been denied, for who knows how long. And all the while, I screamed silently, trapped in a corner of my own mind. As a speech therapist, I had always believed in the power of communication. I had dedicated my life to helping others find their voice. Now, cruelly, I had lost my own. The weekend came to an end, and I returned to my life in the city, to my job at the rehabilitation center. But nothing was the same. Daniel was always there, a shadow in my mind, waiting for moments of weakness to seize control. "You should be grateful," he told me one night as I lay awake, tears streaming silently down my face. "Do you know how long I've waited for this chance? How long I've been trapped between worlds, unable to move on?" "I don't care," I thought back fiercely. "This is my life, my body. You have no right." But Daniel only laughed, the sound echoing in the confines of our shared consciousness. "Rights? My dear Olivia, the dead have no rights. We take what we can get." Days turned into weeks, and I found myself losing more and more time. I would blink and suddenly be in a different place, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My colleagues at work started to notice changes in my behavior, in the way I spoke. "Are you feeling all right, Olivia?" my supervisor, Dr. Patel, asked one day after I had apparently snapped at a patient, something I would never do. "You haven't seemed yourself lately." If only she knew how right she was. "I'm fine," Daniel made me say, his voice a perfect imitation of my own this time. "Just a bit stressed with wedding preparations." Dr. Patel nodded sympathetically, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I wanted to scream, to tell her the truth, but I was powerless. As May's wedding approached, I grew more desperate. I couldn't bear the thought of Daniel being in control on my sister's special day, of ruining the moment with his presence. There had to be a way to get rid of him, to reclaim my life. I began researching exorcisms, spirit attachments, anything that might explain what was happening to me. Late at night, when Daniel's hold on me seemed to weaken, I scoured the internet for answers. It was during one of these late-night searches that I came across a name that made my heart race: Dr. Eleanor Frost, a parapsychologist who specialized in cases of spirit possession. Her office was only a few hours' drive away. "I know what you're planning," Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. "It won't work. We're bound together now, you and I." But for once, I ignored him. I had to try. The next day, I called in sick to work and made the drive to Dr. Frost's office. As I sat in her waiting room, I could feel Daniel's anger simmering beneath the surface of my skin. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "I'm not ready to go back." Back where, I thought. But before he could answer, the receptionist called my name. Dr. Frost was a small, silver-haired woman with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. As I sat across from her, I felt Daniel retreat further into the recesses of my mind. "Tell me what's been happening, Olivia," Dr. Frost said gently, and so I did. I poured out the whole story: the Ouija board, the voice in my head, the loss of control. As I spoke, I felt Daniel's presence grow weaker, as if the very act of acknowledging him out loud was diminishing his power. Dr. Frost listened intently, her expression grave. When I finished, she leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. "Olivia," she said, "I want you to understand that what you're experiencing is real. Spirit attachment is rare, but it does happen, especially when invited through tools like Ouija boards." I felt a surge of relief at her words. Finally, someone believed me. "Can you help me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Can you get him out?" Dr. Frost nodded slowly. "I believe I can, but it won't be easy. Daniel has formed a strong connection to you. Breaking it will require strength, not just from me, but from you as well." Over the next few hours, Dr. Frost led me through a series of exercises designed to strengthen my own spirit and weaken Daniel's hold. We practiced visualization techniques, recited protective incantations, and worked on building mental barriers. As the session progressed, I could feel Daniel's presence growing more agitated, more desperate. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "I'm not ready to move on. There's still so much I need to do." But for the first time since that night with the Ouija board, I felt strong enough to resist him. "This is my life," I thought firmly. "You've overstayed your welcome." Finally, Dr. Frost announced that we were ready for the final step. "This will be intense," she warned. "Daniel won't leave without a fight. Are you prepared?" I nodded, my jaw set with determination. "I'm ready." What followed was the most harrowing experience of my life. Dr. Frost began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, her voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. I felt a pressure building inside my head, as if my skull might split open at any moment. Daniel's voice rose to a scream, reverberating through every fiber of my being. "You can't do this," he howled. "I won't go back to the darkness." Images flashed before my eyes. A car accident, a hospital room, a grief-stricken family. Daniel's memories, I realized. His unfinished business. "I'm sorry," I thought, feeling a sudden wave of compassion for the spirit that had invaded my life. "But this isn't the way. You have to let go." With a final gut-wrenching cry, I felt Daniel's presence tear away from me. The pressure in my head released all at once, and I slumped forward, gasping for air. When I opened my eyes, Dr. Frost was kneeling beside me, her face etched with concern. "It's over," she said softly. "He's gone." I burst into tears, overwhelmed by the sudden silence in my mind. For the first time in weeks, I was alone in my own body. The days that followed were a period of adjustment. I had grown so used to Daniel's presence that its absence left me feeling strangely hollow. But as time passed, I began to rediscover myself, to revel in the simple joy of being in control of my own actions. May's wedding arrived, and I stood beside her as she said her vows, my voice strong and clear as I gave my maid of honor speech. As I looked out at the sea of smiling faces, I felt a profound gratitude for this second chance at life. But even as I celebrated with my family and friends, a part of me couldn't forget Daniel and the glimpse I'd had of his unfinished business. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn to volunteer work at a local hospice, helping patients communicate with their loved ones in their final days. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that I met an elderly man named Robert. As I helped him write a letter to his estranged son, I felt a familiar presence, not inside me this time, but nearby, watching. "Thank you," a voice whispered in my mind. It was Daniel, but his tone was different now, peaceful, ready to move on. "You've helped me find my purpose." I smiled, feeling a sense of closure. "You're welcome," I thought back. And then he was gone, truly gone this time. As I left the hospice that evening, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange journey that had brought me here. The Ouija board that was meant to be a joke had instead opened my eyes to a world beyond our own, a world of spirits and unfinished business, of second chances and redemption. I still work as a speech therapist, helping people find their voices. But now I understand that sometimes the most important conversations happen in silence, in the spaces between words. And on quiet nights, when the veil between worlds feels thin, I think of Daniel and all the other lost souls searching for peace. I no longer fear them. Instead, I listen, ready to help them tell their stories, not through possession, but through compassion and understanding. After all, every voice deserves to be heard, whether it belongs to the living or the dead. I woke up to an eerily quiet house. It was early morning, the first rays of sunlight pushing through the curtains, casting long shadows on the bedroom floor. The bed beside me was neatly made, almost too neatly. Sarah was an early riser, but she never left the bed so immaculate. The silence gnawed at me. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't place it. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice sounding foreign in the heavy stillness. No response. As I made my way downstairs, unease blossomed into full-blown anxiety. The usual hum of the radio playing in the kitchen was absent. There was no aroma of her signature morning coffee wafting through the house. Panic began to set in. This wasn't right. "Sarah, where are you?" I shouted. I searched every room, every corner, opening doors with an urgency that bordered on frenzy. There was no trace of her. The kitchen was spotless, the living room undisturbed, and her favorite book rested on the coffee table, untouched. My heart raced as I ran back upstairs. Our bedroom dresser, once cluttered with Sarah's clothes, was now empty. I yanked open the closet doors, only my clothes hung there. I checked the bathroom. Her toiletries were gone, as if she never existed. I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing her number, only to be met with a cold, automated voice informing me that the number was disconnected. I need proof, something to reassure myself that I'm not losing my mind. I tore through our house, scattering papers, opening drawers, searching for any sign of her. But the more I looked, the more panicked I became. Every photograph, every memento of our life together had disappeared. The picture of us from our wedding day, the framed selfies from our trips, all gone. Desperation drove me to contact our friends and family. I called everyone I could think of, hoping someone remembered her. Each conversation brought further confusion and distress. My parents, who had adored Sarah, expressed blank confusion. "Who's Sarah?" they asked, as if I'd mentioned a complete stranger. "It's Sarah, your daughter-in-law," I insisted. "I'm sorry, son. I don't know what you're talking about." My heart sank. It was as if Sarah had been plucked from existence, leaving me with an overwhelming void filled only with memories. Was I losing my mind? Several exhausting hours later, I found myself in the attic, rummaging through old boxes and dusty keepsakes. I stumbled upon a worn-out journal, mine from several years ago. It was filled with detailed entries of our time together, written in my own hand. Shakily, I sat down and started reading. "Met Sarah today at the cafe downtown. She has the brightest smile," I read aloud. Tears welled up as I flipped through the pages. "Our first anniversary. She loved the necklace I got her." Every entry confirmed what I already knew. Sarah was real. She had to be. Yet, some inexplicable force had erased her from the fabric of this world. The next logical step was to call our mutual friends. Maybe someone could help me make sense of this. I started with Mike and Lisa, our closest friends who'd known us since college. But their responses mirrored those of my parents. They had no recollection of Sarah. Feeling a mix of frustration and dread, I decided to reach out to Sarah's colleague, Dr. Emily Turner. She might not remember her, but she could at least talk about the work Sarah was doing before she vanished. Maybe there was a clue there. I dialed Emily's number, my hands trembling slightly. She picked up on the second ring. "Hello, Emily speaking." "Emily, it's John Miller, Sarah's husband," I said, my voice wavering. There was a moment of silence before she replied, "I'm sorry, who?" "It's John," I repeated, more insistent this time. "Sarah Miller's husband. You worked together on some research." "I'm afraid I don't know any Sarah Miller," Emily said, her tone puzzled. "No, she talked about you all the time." I was practically shouting now. "You were working on some research together. Please think." "I don't know any Sarah," Emily replied, sounding hesitant now, "but I can tell you about my recent project if you want." Realizing it was futile to push further, I agreed. Maybe understanding Emily's research could provide some clues. As I hung up, it dawned on me just how isolated I had become. No one remembered Sarah. It was as if a piece of my soul had been excised from reality. I was the only keeper of our memories, a custodian of a life that might have existed only in my mind. But the journal entries were real. The words, the emotions, they were too vivid to be a fabrication. I refused to let go, to surrender to the madness that threatened to consume me. With determination and dread, I dug deeper, preparing to dive into the fragmented tapestry of my life, desperately seeking threads that could lead me back to Sarah. I couldn't let go of the memories, even if no one else remembered them. The journal was my lifeline, a tangible connection to Sarah. I took it with me everywhere, hoping it would lead me to some answers. Late one night, after hours of anxious thoughts and restless pacing, I remembered the attic. There were more boxes and keepsakes I hadn't sorted through. Perhaps I had missed something that could prove Sarah existed. I climbed the creaky wooden steps, the air thick with dust and nostalgia. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, filled with forgotten belongings. I moved through them, my hands trembling with both anticipation and fear. There it was, tucked away in a corner, an old box marked memories. I opened it and my breath caught. Photographs, letters, and tiny mementos from our life together spilled out. Among them, a worn-out journal I hadn't seen before. As I flipped through it, my own entries leapt off the pages, bringing Sarah back to life through words. One specific entry stood out. Our first anniversary. She loved the necklace I got her. This was real. These memories were real. They had to be. The next day, clutching the journal like a talisman, I drove to the university where Sarah worked. Dr. Emily Turner agreed to meet me in her office. Maybe I could jog her memory, or at least learn more about the work they were doing together. Emily's office was a cluttered haven of books and research papers. She greeted me with a polite but distant smile, offering me a seat. "John, right?" she said. "You mentioned over the phone that you wanted to talk about our research." "Yes, Sarah, my wife. She talked about you and your work. There's something strange going on, and I think it's connected," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. Emily frowned. "As I told you, I don't know a Sarah, but I can tell you about our recent project on quantum mechanics and parallel universes. Maybe it can shed some light." I nodded, barely able to contain my anxiety. Emily began explaining their theories. Ways travel between alternate realities might be possible. Her words blurred together, my mind racing to connect the dots. This was it. This could explain everything. Then something flickered in the periphery of my vision. I turned quickly, seeing nothing but the ordinary office. But the sensation was unsettlingly familiar, a déjà vu that gnawed at my sanity. As I left Emily's office, my nerves were frayed. Could Sarah have somehow traversed into another reality? Was that why no one remembered her? My thoughts spiraled as I drove home, the weight of the journal heavy in my lap. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the world around me seemed to shimmer and twist. I stood up, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only intensified. Then, just for a moment, the room changed. It was as if I was seeing two versions of it overlaying each other. And there, just for a split second, I saw her. "Sarah?" I called out, the name a whisper, a plea. But as quickly as it happened, it was gone. The room returned to its mundane reality, leaving me doubting my own eyes. Panic and hope collided within me. Was I seeing glimpses of another reality, one where Sarah still existed? My mind raced, grasping at the fragile threads of reality that seemed to fray before me. Determined not to lose my grip on what remained of my sanity, I decided to drive to our favorite cafe. Maybe there, in a place rich with shared memories, I could find another piece of the puzzle. The cafe was just as I remembered, a cozy corner of normalcy amidst the chaos of my life. I ordered a coffee and sat at our usual table, scanning the room for any sign, any flicker of change. And then, right there, taped to the inside of the window, I saw it, a photograph of Sarah and me, smiling. I approached it with a mix of dread and elation. On the back of the photograph, in Sarah's delicate handwriting, were the words, "Remember me." My heart pounded as I read the message again and again. This was real. It had to be. She was reaching out from somewhere, somewhen. I clung to the photograph, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. I had to find her. I had to bring her back. Determined, I decided to dive deeper into her notes, her research, anything that could lead me to Sarah. Whatever it took, I would find her. That night, for the first time in weeks, my dreams weren't filled with dread, but with a spark of hope. The photograph felt like a beacon, guiding me through the thick fog of uncertainty. It was a sign that Sarah was out there, somewhere, maybe even trying to come back to me. I couldn't let this chance slip away. I reached out to Mark, my childhood friend. He had always been the pragmatic one, and I needed his clear-headedness now more than ever. Mark arrived at my house, his skeptical look suggesting he thought I might have finally lost it. But he listened as I recounted the horrors of the past days. "You found a picture of you and Sarah at the cafe? And no one else remembers her?" Mark asked, struggling to hide his doubt. "Yes," I insisted. "And there's more. Sarah was working on something before she disappeared, something to do with parallel universes. I think she might have crossed over." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "That's hard to swallow, John. But I've seen weirder things in the military. All right, what do you need me to do?" "Help me get to her lab. I found notes and clues that point there. Maybe we can find more answers," I said. That night, we broke into the old lab where Sarah had conducted her experiments. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals and the hum of dormant machines. Sarah's equipment, meticulously arranged, looked otherworldly in the dim light. I showed Mark Sarah's journal and the photograph. We began combing through the lab, trying to decipher her notes on quantum mechanics and alternate realities. Mark's practical mindset complemented my growing obsession, grounding me as we worked. Hours passed. Just when my hope began to wane, we found it, a handwritten note tucked inside an old science book. It contained a series of mathematical equations and a coded message. Follow the path. Remember the date, or 4/07/15. The date held significance. It was our anniversary, the same day I read about in my journal. But what did it mean? As we puzzled over the note, I experienced another glitch. The room briefly shimmered, and for an instant I saw Sarah standing by the lab bench, looking at me with sorrowful eyes. "John," she whispered, "find me." I blinked, and she was gone again. Mark saw my dazed expression. "Did you see her?" "Yes," I whispered, voice trembling. "She asked me to find her." Driven by this vision, I worked tirelessly on the equations. We set up the equipment according to the instructions, hoping to replicate whatever Sarah had done. As the machine powered up, the room filled with a soft, resonant hum. We input the date, our anniversary, the one significant number Sarah had left for us. My heart pounded as the machine's hum grew louder, enveloping us in its otherworldly resonance. Mark stood by, ready to pull me back if anything went wrong. "Are you sure about this, John?" Mark asked, concern etched on his face. "I have to be. I need to find her," I replied, stepping closer to the machine. The room began to twist and bend, the machines flickering in and out of focus like a surreal painting. I felt a pull, not physical, but existential, tugging at the very fabric of my being. "Sarah," I called out, hoping against hope she could hear me. Then the world snapped. I was standing in the same room, but it was different. The equipment was arranged as if someone had been working just moments ago. And there she was, Sarah, standing by the lab bench, looking at me with wide eyes. "John," she whispered, stepping towards me. "Sarah," I ran to her, wrapping her in my arms. "What happened? Where are we? Why doesn't anyone remember you?" "We're in another reality," she explained, tears in her eyes. "I was working on a way to cross over to study parallel universes, but something went wrong. When I crossed, it erased me from our original world." "We can go back, can't we? Together?" I asked, desperation in my voice. "I think so, but there's a risk. The transition could separate us again, forever." "No, we'll do it together. I can't lose you again," I insisted. Together, we worked swiftly, recalibrating the machine to return us to our original reality. The room filled with that same resonant hum, the world beginning to twist and shimmer once more. As the transition began, I held Sarah's hand tightly, afraid to let go. The world snapped again. I found myself back in our home, gasping for breath. Sarah was beside me, her hand still in mine. I turned to her, eyes brimming with tears. "Sarah, are you here? Really here?" She smiled, squeezing my hand. "Yes, John, I'm here. We made it." But as I looked around, something still felt off. A subtle change in the air, a lingering sense of unease. The world outside the window seemed just a shade different. Had we really returned home? Or had we crossed into yet another reality? As we stood together holding each other tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was far from over. "John," her voice interjected, slow and deliberate. "I-M-I-S-S-E-D-Y-O-U. I missed you too, Sarah," I replied, hoping against the creeping dread that this reality would be the one where we truly belonged. I never should have listened to those tapes. But when you're a true crime podcaster scraping the bottom of the barrel for content, you take what you can get. I told myself it was just research, just another story to tell. I had no idea those grainy recordings would become my own personal nightmare. It all started with an email from a listener. "Hey, I've got something you might be interested in," it said. My grandfather was a cop back in the 70s. When he died, we found some old evidence tapes in his attic. Cold case stuff, never been released to the public. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the setup for every bad horror movie ever made. But when you've been doing this as long as I have, you learn to take risks. Besides, I'd vetted the source as best I could. The guy seemed legit, and his grandfather's career checked out. So I agreed to meet him. The exchange was quick, almost furtive. A plain brown package, handed over in a crowded coffee shop. "Be careful with these," he said, his eyes darting around nervously. Some things are better left in the past." I should have listened to him, should have tossed that package in the nearest dumpster and walked away. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and it was about to lead me down a path I could never return from. The tapes were old, that much was clear. 5 of them, labeled simply Interview 1 through Interview 5. The case file that came with them was sparse, a series of disappearances in a small Midwestern town, all within the span of a month. No bodies ever found, no suspects ever named. The kind of case that keeps cops up at night. I started listening that very evening, notepad at the ready, eager for a new story to tell. The first tape was pretty standard stuff, background on the case, details of the investigation, but there was something off about the way the detective spoke. A tension in his voice, like he was holding something back. It was the second tape where things started to get weird. The detective was interviewing a witness, an old woman who lived on the edge of town. Her voice quavered as she spoke. "It's the house," she said. "That old Crowley place. It takes people." The detective's skepticism was clear. "Ma'am, houses don't take people. Now, did you see anything unusual on the night of—" "You're not listening," the woman interrupted, her voice rising to a shriek. "It's alive. Those walls, they breathe, they hunger, and when it calls your name, you have no choice but to answer." I paused the tape, my heart racing. It was creepy, sure, but nothing I hadn't heard before. Just the ramblings of a scared old woman, I told myself. Nothing more. If only I'd stopped there. The third tape was where things took a turn. The detective was alone, apparently dictating notes to himself. His voice was shaky, uncertain. I went to the Crowley house today," he said. "Just to check it out, you know. But when I got there, God, I don't know how to explain this. The door was open, just a crack, and I could have sworn I heard singing, coming from inside. A woman's voice so beautiful it made my heart ache. I wanted to go in. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to step through that door. But something held me back. When I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in an upstairs window. A face, pale as death, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. It smiled at me. There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of ragged breathing. Then, so quiet I almost missed it. It knew my name. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted in my world. But still I pressed on. The need to know, to understand, overrode any sense of self-preservation I might have had. The fourth tape was nothing but static. 45 minutes of white noise that set my teeth on edge. But underneath, barely audible, I could make out what sounded like whispers. Dozens of voices, all talking at once, too quiet to make out the words. I listened to that tape 3 times, straining to understand. By the third listen, I was sure the whispers were getting louder. It was the final tape that broke me. It started normally enough. The detective, his voice now a flat monotone, giving what seemed to be a final report on the case. "Investigation suspended," he said. "No further leads. No evidence of foul play. Missing persons presumed." Here, he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Deeper, somehow. Echoing, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "They're here," he said. "In the walls, in the floors, in the air we breathe. They're everywhere, and they're so hungry." There was a sound then, like a rush of wind, or maybe the sigh of some enormous beast. And then, clear as day, I heard my own name, spoken in a voice that was not the detective's, was not human at all. I ripped the headphones off, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The tapes lay scattered on my desk, innocent-looking spools of plastic that had just turned my world upside down. I'd like to say I destroyed those tapes, that I burned them, or buried them, or threw them into the deepest part of the ocean. But I didn't. They're still here, in a box under my bed. Because as terrified as I am, as much as I want to forget everything I heard, there's a part of me that needs to know more. Sometimes late at night, I think I can hear them calling to me, whispering my name in voices that slither through the dark. And sometimes, God help me, I want to answer. I don't make podcasts anymore. Don't listen to the radio or watch TV or do anything that might carry a stray sound to my ears, because now I know the truth. There are things out there, things that live in the spaces between what we can see and touch, things that hunger for us in ways we can't comprehend, and they know how to call us, how to lure us in with a beautiful song or a whispered promise, or maybe just an old tape that should have stayed lost. If you're listening to this, consider it a warning. Be careful what you go looking for. Be careful what stories you choose to tell, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. As for me, I'm still here, still waiting. For what I'm not sure. Maybe for the courage to destroy those tapes once and for all. Or maybe for the day when the call becomes too strong to resist. Because that's the real horror, isn't it? Not the monsters lurking in the shadows, but the part of us that wants to join them. The part that hears their song and finds it beautiful. So if you ever come across a mysterious package or an old tape that promises to reveal some long-buried secret, do yourself a favor. Walk away. Because once you've heard the call, you can never unhear it. And sooner or later, willing or not, you'll answer. As for me, well, let's just say I'm learning to live with the whispers, and praying that's all they'll ever be. Part 1 of the story. Last night, I held my wife Sarah in my arms. This morning, it's as if she never existed. My reality has changed, and I might be next. I woke up early, the morning light trickling through the bedroom window, casting a pale glow on the bed. My hand reached out instinctively for Sarah's side, but all I felt was cold, unwrinkled sheets. I blinked, my mind struggling to catch up with the gnawing pit of anxiety forming in my stomach. This wasn't right. Sarah had always been an early riser, but she never left the bed so pristine. Sarah? My voice cracked, raw with sleep and a sudden spike of fear. No response. The house was eerily silent. I threw off the covers and hurried through the house, calling her name again. The bathroom was empty, the kitchen was untouched, and the living room was devoid of life. Panic set in as I checked every room, every corner where she might be. Nothing. No sign. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Heart pounding, I dialed her number. The mechanical voice on the other end chilled me to the bone. This number is no longer in service. My hand started to shake. Dismissing it as some technical malfunction, I called my closest friend, Matt. Hey Matt, it's Mark. Have you seen Sarah? Who? Matt's voice was thick with confusion. Sarah, my wife. We just had dinner with you last week. Mark, are you okay? You've always lived alone. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. No, Matt. We've been married for 10 years. We had dinner just last week. She was there. There was a pause, then a click as Matt hung up, undoubtedly worried for my sanity. My heart raced as I called other friends, family members, anyone who might know Sarah. The responses were all the same. No one remembered her, as if she had evaporated from existence. The more I called, the more frantic I became, until finally, I stared at the phone in disbelief. How could she be erased from everyone's memory? Desperately, I tore through the house looking for any proof of Sarah's existence. Our wedding photo, gone. Her clothes, missing. Her books, her favorite coffee mug, even her hairbrush, all absent. It was as if she had never lived here at all. I slumped to the ground, head spinning, tears of frustration and fear welling up in my eyes. I knew I needed help, so I sought out Dr. Ellie Foster, a seasoned therapist. Her office was a comforting place, filled with warm colors and soft textures meant to put her patients at ease. The light filtering through the window made patterns on the floor as she watched me with kind, knowing eyes. Tell me about Sarah, she said gently. She's my wife. We've been married for 10 years. But now, it's like she never existed. No one remembers her, not even my friends or family. Dr. Foster nodded, scribbling notes. And you have no physical proof of her existence? No. Everything's gone. She's gone. My voice cracked under the weight of my anguish. She leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but clinical. Mark, it's possible you're experiencing a severe form of dissociation or a memory disorder. Sometimes our minds create memories. No, I slammed my fist on the arm of the chair. She's real. Our life was real. I am not making this up. She nodded again, though I could see the concern in her eyes. Let's work through this together. If she was real, We'll find a way to get to the bottom of this." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I could see her doubt. The session ended, and I left feeling no closer to an answer than when I arrived. That night, alone in my now seemingly alien house, I found an old leather-bound journal tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. Skeptically, I opened it and began to read. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each entry detailing intimate moments of a life with Sarah. But the handwriting wasn't mine. The entries were vivid, describing memories I clearly recalled, but they were signed. I froze as I reached the last page, where the final entry stood out. Dr. Nathan Hollis. I had no recollection of a Dr. Nathan. Hollis. Who was he? And why did he know so much about Sarah and me? From that point on, the journal became my lifeline to the truth I desperately sought, leading me to a potential ally in my unraveling world. Part 2 of the story. The journal entries consumed me, each one an invocation of my life with Sarah that I desperately needed to validate. And the elusive figure of Dr. Nathan Hollis hung in the air like an unspoken promise. If he had answers, I needed to find him. I checked the university campuses and public records, piecing together fragments of his existence. Each detail made him more real. Dr. Hollis was a historian specializing in anomalous events, his work buried under layers of academic obscurity. Eventually, I traced his office to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The place was a maze of books and papers, the smell of old parchment hanging in the air. Dr. Hollis himself was hunched over a desk, engrossed in some manuscript. It took several knocks for him to even notice me. When he did, his sharp blue eyes pierced through me. "Dr. Hollis." My voice trembled. "I'm Mark Thompson. I need your help." He eyed me warily but motioned for me to sit. "What can I do for you?" I showed him the journal. His eyes widened, a flash of recognition stirring within them. "Where did you get this?" "It was in my attic. These entries, they're about my wife, Sarah." My breath caught. "But she's gone, erased. No one remembers her but me, and you." Dr. Hollis leaned back, his expression softening. "You're not the first to come to me with a story like this. Sit down, Mark. Tell me everything." I recounted every detail while he listened intently, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he stared at a point in the distance, lost in thought. "I've been studying these phenomena for decades," he began. "People disappearing, memories being altered. I lost my daughter the same way 10 years ago. One day she was there, the next, gone, and everyone but me forgot she ever existed." His words struck a chord within me, a mixture of fear and hope rising. "So there are others?" "Many, all with similar stories. I've been trying to find a pattern, some explanation for these anomalies." We spent hours discussing theories from alternate dimensions to malevolent manipulations of reality. Despite our fervent discussions, the source of these disruptions remained elusive. It felt as though we were grasping at shadows in a pitch-dark room. Over the next few weeks, we combed through archives, dissected historical anomalies, and shared findings with others who had experienced similar losses. Each revelation brought us no closer to an answer, only deepening the mystery. My world became a labyrinth of uncertainties, each step echoing with a silent, sinister laughter. In the midst of this, the most disconcerting event occurred. I was in the kitchen one evening, trying to distract myself with the monotony of making dinner. Setting the table, I noticed that the same floral patterned plate moved from one hand to the other, as if it had never been on the table at all. I froze, the plate clattering to the floor. Objects around the house began shifting locations with disturbing frequency. A book I'd placed on the coffee table would later resurface in the bathroom. A glass of water on the nightstand would end up in the kitchen sink. Every glitch in my reality sent a shiver down my spine, leaving me in a constant state of anxiety. The worst moments were when conversations inexplicably changed mid-sentence. Dr. Hollis and I sat in a small cafe discussing our findings, his voice blending seamlessly from discussing a historical event to suddenly speaking of flowers in his garden without any logical transition. I stared at him in shock, which made him stop abruptly, his expression mirroring mine. Did you hear that?" My voice was barely a whisper. His eyes widened with understanding. "It happened again, didn't it?" I nodded, my mouth dry. Reality itself seemed to be conspiring against us, reshaping our lives with each passing day. Dr. Hollis's presence was the only anchor in this ever-shifting storm. Late one night, as we pored over some old manuscripts, I happened upon a small note scribbled in the margin, a name that echoed like a ghost through time. Emily, lost but not forgotten. My heart pounded as I realized it had to be Dr. Hollis's daughter. Her existence acknowledged, even if just in these hidden margins. In our most desperate moment, we sought solace in each other's company, the old journal and our shared experiences binding us together. The pursuit of truth became our only refuge in a world gone awry, each discovery bringing us closer to an inevitable confrontation with the unknown forces at play. The air grew thicker with tension. In every reflection, every missed heartbeat, we sensed the invisible hand rewriting our lives. Our only choice was to wade deeper into the nightmare, hoping to unearth the dark architect behind these shifting realities. Part 3 of the story. The oddities of my warping reality kept mounting. One day I decided to revisit the local market, hoping the familiar surroundings might offer some semblance of normalcy or even an unexpected clue. The day was bustling, the market stalls overflowing with colors and sounds, a stark contrast to the silent void in my heart. As I wandered through the marketplace, my mind swirled with past and present, the old reality interweaving with the new. And then, in the midst of the cacophony, a flash of golden brown hair caught my eye. I turned, heart racing. Was it really her? My breath quickened as I began to weave through the crowd, calling out her name. Sarah! She glanced back, her eyes locking with mine for a fleeting moment. That recognition, it was unmistakable. I pushed harder through the throng, desperate to reach her. People jostled past, their faces blurred and unimportant. My entire world narrowed to that one figure ahead of me. Sarah, wait! She turned down a narrow alley, and I followed without hesitation. But when I reached the end of the alley, she was gone. Panic set in as I scanned the small space, calling her name again and again. The alley was empty, just as our house had been that fateful morning. My steps faltered, my shoulders sinking in despair. Had I truly seen her, or was it another cruel twist of my fractured reality? The market's noise faded to a dull roar behind me, leaving me alone with my haunted thoughts. The realization that I might never find her, that she might forever remain an illusion, struck me like a physical blow. Returning home, the once lively house now felt like a mausoleum of forgotten dreams. I collapsed on the living room couch, staring at the spot where our wedding photo used to stand, feeling the weight of every lost moment pressing down on me. Sarah's laughter, her touch, her very essence, all snatched away by an unfathomable force. As the dim light of evening crept in, my mind wandered to the journal and the elusive Dr. Hollis's final note about his daughter, Emily. It resonated deeply with my own sorrow, the struggle to hold on to memories that reality itself sought to erase. Sitting there in the gathering shadows, a thought gnawed at me, dark and insidious. If reality could be rewritten so easily, what was stopping it from erasing me next? My pulse quickened as the walls around me distorted, the furniture seeming to melt and reshape before my eyes. Suddenly, a voice echoed from nowhere, slicing through the oppressive silence. M-A-R-K-U-A-K-E-U-P. I sprang up, heart hammering. Who's there? The house answered with nothing but an echo. My vision swam, a dizziness overtaking me as I walked unsteadily to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection stared back, eyes wide with terror. For a heartbeat, it seemed to waver, morphing into a face that wasn't mine, then snapping back. I sank to my knees, gripping the edge of the dresser. This isn't real. This can't be real. But deep down, I knew it was more real than anything I had ever experienced. The journal, Sarah's disappearance, the haunting connection with Dr. Hollis, it all pointed to an unseen entity playing God with our lives. That night, I sat in silence, the room's shadows growing longer, encompassing the last vestiges of my sanity. As I gazed at where Sarah's picture once stood, a cold acceptance began to settle over me. I realized I was just another pawn, another name in the journal of twisted fate. I whispered to the empty room, "If you're gonna take me, do it now. Erase me like you did with Sarah." But nothing came. Only the ticking of the clock marking the slow passage of time, the relentless march toward an uncertain end. I realized this was my new existence, a world where time could shift, and my very being could be erased. In that moment, I understood the cold, chilling nature of my reality. "EXISTENCEISFLUID," I muttered to myself, the words almost a prayer. The house creaked and groaned as if in response, its skeleton shifting on invisible joints. Slowly I stood, feeling more alone than ever. One day I knew I might wake up as if I had never existed at all, just another ghost in the machine of a capricious universe. The past horror and present dread merged into a singular truth, one that I reluctantly accepted. Just as I had lost Sarah, the world could lose me. And whatever force was behind this would continue its dark work, reshaping lives and memories, leaving nothing but fading echoes of what once was. I woke up to an empty bed, reaching out for the familiar warmth beside me. Confused, I blinked against the sunlight filtering through the curtains. My hand met only cold, empty sheets. I glanced around, half expecting to see Emily standing nearby, maybe with a teasing smile and a morning coffee. But the room was empty, silent save for the distant chirping of birds. "Emily?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. No answer. I sat up, a knot forming in my stomach. Emily always woke up before me, tiptoeing around to avoid waking me, but she never left without a trace. Sliding out of bed, I searched the bedroom. Her robe, usually hung on the back of the door, was missing. Her slippers weren't by the bedside. I headed to the bathroom, my heart pounding. Everything was in place, except for the absence of her toothbrush, her makeup, anything that showed another person lived here. Panic gnawed at me. I threw on some clothes and continued my search. Downstairs, the kitchen was as I left it the night before. But Emily's favorite mug wasn't on the counter, and there was no sign of her breakfast ritual. I checked the living room, the backyard. Every room felt eerily untouched, like a stage set after the actors had left. My mind raced. Was she playing a prank? Had she left for an emergency? I grabbed my phone, dialing her number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried her friends, my own friends, anyone who might have seen her. Each conversation was met with confusion, as if they had no idea who Emily was. The knot in my stomach tightened. I checked our wedding photos on the mantel, only to find empty frames. The photo albums stored in the hall closet were devoid of any evidence of our life together, just blank pages where cherished memories should have been. She must be somewhere, I muttered to myself, trying to rein in the rising dread. She has to be. I decided to call Martin, a childhood friend and private investigator. "Martin, I need your help," I said, my voice trembling. "Emily is missing. Everything about her is gone." There was a long pause before Martin responded, his tone cautious. "David, are you sure? Maybe you're just tired or stressed. Maybe she's out for a while." "No, you don't understand," I insisted. "It's like she never existed." Martin's skepticism was palpable, but he agreed to meet me later that day. In the meantime, I ransacked the house for any sign of Emily. Cabinets, drawers, old boxes in the attic, nothing. Every trace of her had vanished. Hours later, when Martin arrived, I led him through the house, showing him the empty frames and the void where Emily's belongings once were. He listened, brows furrowed, doubt etched across his face. "David, I don't know what to say," Martin finally admitted. "This doesn't make any sense. Are you sure?" "I'm not crazy, Martin," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "I know my wife. I know she was here." Martin raised his hands in a placating gesture. Okay. Let's look into this together. Maybe there's an explanation we haven't considered." We started with Emily's workplace. The school where she taught was a short drive away. The moment we walked in, the receptionist greeted me with a blank stare when I asked for Emily. "I'm sorry, who?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but puzzled. "Emily Thompson. She works here. 5th grade teacher," I replied, anxiety gnawing at me. The receptionist shook her head. "There's no one by that name here." I felt my world tilting. Martin stepped in, his authoritative voice cutting through my disbelief. "Could you check again? This is very important." The receptionist frowned, tapping away at her computer. A few tense minutes later, she looked up, shaking her head again. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of an Emily Thompson ever working here." Martin placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, his expression grim. "Let's keep looking, David. Maybe there's another explanation." As we left the school, I felt a growing sense of dread. How could Emily have been erased so completely? Every step we took in our search seemed to push me further into an unfathomable nightmare. Days turned into a haze of confusion and futile searches. No one remembered her. It was as if she had been plucked out of existence, leaving me alone in a world that no longer made sense. One night, in a fit of desperation, I stormed into the attic. Frenzied, I tore through boxes of old belongings, desperately seeking anything that tied Emily to this reality. As I rummaged through the clutter, my hand brushed against a hidden drawer at the bottom of an old trunk. I yanked it open, my heart racing. Inside, I found a collection of mementos, a dried rose from our first date, a ticket stub from a concert, and a faded photograph of Emily and me. Tears welled in my eyes as I cradled these precious remnants of our life together. At the bottom of the drawer was a single yellowed note, written in Emily's handwriting. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "If you're reading this," the note began, "it's already too late. They've rewritten our lives." I stared at the note, my mind struggling to comprehend the message. THUYHVWRITN-ORLIVS. The words echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain in an endless loop. The note slipped from my trembling fingers, settling back into the drawer. Emily's message echoed in my mind, creating a dissonant symphony of confusion and dread. I crumpled to the floor, the hidden mementos scattered around me, remnants of a life that, according to everyone else, never existed. I stared at Emily's handwriting, my mind racing. Rewritten our lives? What did that mean? And who were they? My head throbbed with questions that felt like they had no hope of answers. "David, are you okay?" Martin's voice jolted me from my reverie. He had been watching me from the attic entrance, concern etched across his face. I handed him the note. She knew, Martin. She knew something was happening. Martin read the note, his expression shifting from confusion to incredulity. I don't even know what this is." "I'm not crazy," I insisted, the words barely more than a whisper. Emily was real, and she knew something that I don't. Martin sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, let's figure this out. Maybe there's more to this than we can see." As night fell, the already strange atmosphere became even more oppressive. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the lights seemed amplified, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. "Let's retrace your steps," Martin suggested, his voice practical. "Maybe there's something we've missed." We started by going through my call logs, text messages, and emails, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain Emily's sudden erasure. But each search was as empty as the last. It was as if a meticulously planned sabotage had erased her from every aspect of my life. Late into the night, exhausted and frustrated, we decided to take a break. Martin offered to stay over, reluctant to leave me alone in my agitated state. I was grateful for his presence, a tie to a world that still made some sense. As Martin settled on the couch, I wandered back upstairs, drawn again to the attic where I had found the note. The room felt heavier, the shadows deeper. Suddenly I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The sensation of being watched pressed in on me, more suffocating than before. I backed up nervously, only to trip over a box and crash to the floor. As I struggled to my feet, the shadows in the attic seemed to shift and twist, forming vague, menacing shapes. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The oppressive silence that followed was unnerving. My skin prickled with the awareness of an unseen presence. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it into the darkened corners. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dust and old furniture. Still, the feeling of being observed wouldn't leave me. "David?" Martin called from downstairs, his voice muffled but concerned. "I'm fine," I called back, but as I descended the stairs, the oppressive sensation of being watched followed me. I tried to shake it off, but sleep was elusive that night. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Emily's note plagued me, blending into dark dreams of shadowy figures and rewritten lives. A few nights later, things took a more terrifying turn. I was alone in the living room, sifting through old memories when the room's temperature seemed to plummet. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite the heating being on. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more defined, and I felt a coldness seeping into my bones. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't see or understand. Suddenly, the shadows began to move, creeping along the walls and floor like living oil. Panic surged through me as I watched them converge, forming the outline of a figure in the center of the room. "Who are you?" I demanded, desperation lacing my voice. The shadowy figure did not respond, but I felt its presence intensify. A cold, disembodied whisper drifted to my ears, a chilling blend of menace and sorrow. "You were not meant to remember," it hissed, the words slicing through the air. "MEANTTOREEMBER." I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The figure dissipated, the shadows retreating back to their corners, leaving the room as it was before. But the cold, aching fear remained. I called Martin immediately, unable to keep the terror out of my voice. He listened as I breathlessly recounted what had happened. "I believe you, David," he said quietly, his earlier skepticism now replaced with genuine concern. "Whatever is happening, it's beyond anything we can understand, but we'll figure it out, together." In that moment, with the phone to my ear and my heart still racing, I realized that the boundaries of my reality had been breached, and I was standing on the edge of an incomprehensible abyss. Emily's note echoed in my mind, the chilling reality of rewritten lives settling into my bones. The days blurred into one nightmarish sequence, each filled with an uneasy sense that my reality was crumbling. The hours I didn't spend obsessively searching for answers, I spent haunted by the chilling encounters with those strange entities. Martin, ever the cautious investigator, stuck by me, continuing to lend his support and pragmatism. One evening, Martin and I were sitting in the living room, reviewing documents. He paused, looking at me with a mixture of concern and determination. "David, I think we need to confront whatever this is directly. We can't keep running or hiding." I nodded, a grim resolve settling over me. We need to confront these shadows. As night fell, the air grew heavy again, and a familiar chill settled in, seeping through the walls. We positioned ourselves in the center of the living room, the only light coming from the flickering fireplace. The shadows seemed thicker, darker, as if the night itself was congealing into something sentient. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in clouds, visible in the cold air. Martin and I shared a look, a silent agreement to stand our ground. The shadows began to move, creeping along the floor, walls, and ceiling, converging once again to form a nebulous figure. It stood before us, a void of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I clenched my fists, forcing my voice to remain steady. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" The shadow figure did not reply immediately. Instead, the cold whisper I'd come to dread began to fill the room. "You were not meant to remember." MEANTTEEMEMBER. Martin stepped forward, his voice firm. "Why rewrite our lives? What's the purpose?" The figure's form wavered, as if considering whether to answer. Then, in that same chilling whisper, it spoke. "We protect the fabric of reality. Some must be forgotten to maintain balance." BALANCE. She was real, I argued, my voice rising with desperation. Emily was real. Our life was real. The figure's whisper seemed to echo from all around us. "She was never meant to be. She disrupted the order. The memory of her endangers you." Martin's face tightened with determination. "That's a lie. We have proof she existed." The figure shifted, and suddenly I felt a pull, a force drawing on my mind. Images of Emily flashed before me, distorted memories blending with new, unwelcome ones. My knees buckled under the weight of the mental onslaught. Martin grabbed my arm, steadying me. "David, fight it!" In a moment of clarity, I forced myself to remember Emily, her laughter, her warmth, the love that had bound us together. I felt a surge of strength, pushing the invasive presence away. The shadow figure recoiled, its form destabilizing. "Your defiance endangers you," it hissed. ENDANGERSYOU. I faced it, breathing hard. "I'd rather die with my memories than live in your rewritten reality." The figure wavered once more, then dissipated, the shadows retreating as quickly as they had come. The room warmed almost instantly, the sense of oppressive doom lifting. Martin looked at me, concern and pride mingling in his expression. "I think we won. They won't be back." But deep down, I knew better. The battle wasn't over. I could feel it in the fragments of reality that had been tampered with, in the quiet whispers that still occasionally haunted my dreams. The next morning I woke with a sense of dread. The house, our once vibrant home, felt even more distorted. The rooms seemed slightly different, colors less vivid. It was as if reality was struggling to correct itself, but failing. I stumbled into the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. As I looked into the mirror, the reflection stared back at me, unfamiliar in some ways. It was me, but slightly altered, as if the very nature of who I was had been rewritten. I thought of Emily's note, the ominous warning. She had known something profound, something I was only beginning to grasp. As I left the bathroom, Martin called from the kitchen, offering a semblance of normalcy over breakfast. I joined him, but the food tasted bland, the colors muted. Everything felt off. We sat in silence, both of us knowing that this reality was now a fractured one. Martin sighed. "What's next?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I have to keep searching. I have to find some way to fix this." Martin nodded, his eyes filled with a somber resolve. "We'll find a way, together." And so, the search continues. Each day I wake in a world that feels increasingly alien. My memories of Emily both a solace and a curse. I know that confronting the fabric of our reality comes with a price I am willing to pay to hold on to the truth of who we were. As for the shadowy figures, they remain a haunting presence on the edges of my consciousness. The fight for my reality, for the memory of Emily, has only just begun. I can still hear the whispers at night, voices of the damned, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. It all started with a single foolish night. The storm outside was relentless, lightning crackling through the night sky and thunder rolling like an angry beast. It was the perfect setting for our adventure, or so we thought. The ancient manor loomed before us, an eerie silhouette against the storm's fury. Its windows were like dead eyes, watching, waiting. We were there to celebrate the end of our college years, a last hurrah before stepping into the adult world. There was me, Thomas, always the skeptic, brushing off ghost stories and superstitions. Sarah, with her wide eyes and insatiable curiosity, was enthralled by anything paranormal. Rachel's sharp wit often masked her own fears, while Mike, the rational thinker, considered it all a silly lark. Together, we decided on the mansion, driven by the thrill of the unknown and the storm that seemed to beckon us inside. The creaky door groaned in protest as we pushed it open, stepping into the decaying grandeur of the entrance hall. Dust particles floated in the air, disturbed by our intrusion. The mansion felt alive in its decay, every creak and groan echoing like a whisper of disapproval. "It's just a house," Mike said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Sarah spotted the attic door, a rope hanging like a forgotten piece of history. "Let's check up there. Maybe we'll find something interesting," she insisted, her enthusiasm infectious despite the growing tension. We followed her up the rickety stairs, our flashlights casting long, ghostly shadows. The attic was cluttered with the remnants of a bygone era, dusty trunks, broken furniture, and then near the back, an old, forgotten Ouija board. "Let's play," Sarah said, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation. I laughed, shaking my head. "You really think this thing works?" "Only one way to find out," Rachel chimed in, though her attempt at bravado didn't quite mask her wariness. We gathered around the board, sitting cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, the storm outside an angry backdrop to our folly. Sarah lit a few candles, their flickering light creating dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. "Who's gonna start?" Mike asked, his doubt evident. "I will," Sarah declared, placing her fingers lightly on the planchette. We followed suit, forming a circle of intertwined fates. She took a deep breath, voice steady but eyes flicking nervously. "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette moved slowly at first, a hesitant slide across the board. We watched in uncomfortable silence, laughter dying as the atmosphere shifted. "Whose idea was this again?" Rachel muttered, her voice a weak attempt to cut the tension. Then the planchette jerked sharply, spelling out a name. Caroline. I shivered involuntarily. "This is a joke, right? Who's moving it?" No one answered. The silence grew, thick and oppressive, as the planchette continued its erratic dance across the board. It spelled out more words, a series of confusing and deeply personal messages that gnawed at our nerves. Danger. This is getting too real. We should stop. Mike's voice was shaking now. The calm facade completely shattered. But the planchette didn't stop. It kept spelling out things only we would know. Our deepest fears, our hidden traumas, the darkest corners of our souls. The room grew colder, our breath visible in the flickering candlelight. Sarah's face was pale, her fingers trembling. "What do you want?" she asked the board, her voice barely a whisper. Release. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Was this real? Could there be a spirit trapped, using us to find freedom? The thought was absurd, yet the fear was tangible, clawing at my rational mind. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, looking as if she had been struck. Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed, convulsing violently. We jumped to her side, the board forgotten as panic took over. Sarah, wake up!" I shouted, trying to hold her steady. Her eyes snapped open, wide and terrified, and she spoke with a voice that wasn't her own. "You mustn't leave. The cycle must continue. The whispers. The room's temperature plunged. We dragged Sarah away from the board, the air thick with an oppressive, otherworldly presence. The storm outside raged on, but inside, something far more sinister was brewing, binding us in a cycle of horror we were only beginning to understand. Sarah's eyes fluttered as she regained consciousness, but she looked more terrified than ever. "We need to end this," Mike said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. I nodded, moving back to the board with a determination born from terror. "We're saying goodbye now," I declared as firmly as I could. But when we placed our fingers back on the planchette, it wouldn't budge. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Rachel began to pray, but it only seemed to anger the entity. The room grew colder, the air thickening as an unseen presence closed in around us. "It's not going to let us go," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Desperation clawed at my throat. I grabbed the board, ready to fling it against the wall, but something stopped me. An invisible force held me in place, the whispers louder, more insistent. "END," my mind screamed, but my body wouldn't comply. Then the planchette moved again, faster this time. RELEASE. "Release us," Sarah translated, her voice hollow. "It wants us to say the words." We looked at each other, fear mirrored in every face. But before we could decide, a violent jolt threw us all back. Sarah screamed, clutching her head as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. We scrambled to our feet, dragging Sarah along, our minds set on one goal: escape. The mansion seemed to warp around us, hallways stretching endlessly as if trying to trap us within. "Get to the door," Mike shouted, his voice barely audible over the piercing noise. We stumbled and staggered, the path to the exit twisting in ways that defied logic. Shadows danced along the walls, mocking our every step. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. Finally, we burst through the front door into the cold night air, the storm's fury feeling almost a relief compared to the suffocating presence inside. We didn't stop running until we reached our cars, panting and wide-eyed, too shaken to speak. But the real horror followed us home. That night, and every night after, the whispers invaded our dreams, turning sleep into a torturous ordeal. We saw glimpses of the entity, a shadowy figure with eyes that bore into our souls, murmuring in tongues ancient and dreadful. Rachel started avoiding sleep altogether, her eyes haunted by exhaustion. "If I fall asleep, it wins," she said one day, her voice a broken whisper. Sarah's condition worsened. Her moments of clarity grew rare, her mind a battleground she couldn't escape. She rambled incoherently, eyes unfocused, as if perpetually caught in a nightmare. Mike, always the rational one, tried to research ways to break the curse, but his skepticism gave way to paranoia. He saw shadows where there were none, flinched at every whisper of the wind. And me? I could barely hold it together. The constant presence of the whispers, the never-ending torment, it all took a toll I couldn't measure. The worst part was the helplessness, knowing we had unleashed something we couldn't understand, let alone control. Sleep became a battleground where we fought night after night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of the damned still reverberating in my ears. It felt like drowning in a sea of horror, gasping for breaths of sanity that never truly came. We tried to distance ourselves, but it made no difference. The entity had latched onto us, a parasite that fed off our fear. There was no escape, only moments of brief respite before the cycle began anew each night. God help us, we'd unleashed hell, and there was no way to put it back. Years slipped by, each one dragging us further into madness. Sarah remained in a coma, her body a shell devoid of the vibrant spirit she once had. Rachel moved away, attempting to restart her life, but it didn't help. The whispers found her, no matter where she hid. Mike, now a shadow of his former self, grew increasingly obsessed with breaking the curse. He spent his days buried in books and his nights in restless vigil, fending off the phantoms of his mind. And me, I felt an unshakable pull back to that mansion. The whispers morphed into a siren call, each night blending into a ceaseless plea to return. One evening, unable to resist any longer, I found myself driving back to where it all began, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, seemingly untouched by the passage of time. As I approached, an unsettling sense of déjà vu washed over me. I stepped out of the car, the whispers intensifying in my mind. Inside, the air was as cold and oppressive as I remembered. The floorboards creaked under my feet, as if the house itself remembered and resented my return. As I navigated the hallways, I heard voices, young, trembling, eerily familiar. My heart sank. There they were, a new group of intrepid explorers gathered around a fresh Ouija board. Fear and excitement warred on their faces, mirroring our expressions from that fateful night. I watched in horror as they placed their fingers on the planchette. "You need to stop," I called out, my voice trembling with urgency. They looked up, startled and confused. "Who are you?" one of them asked, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes. "I've been through this. You have to leave now. It's not a game." I stumbled towards them, each step feeling like wading through thick sludge. "No way, man. You're just trying to scare us," one of the guys scoffed, defiance masking his fear. Before I could argue, the planchette jerked to life. Their faces went pale as they spelled out, RELEASE. Realization dawned with a chill that settled deep in my bones. The entity wasn't just tormenting us, it was drawing in new victims to sustain its grip on this world. The cycle was endless, feeding on fear and desperation. "Listen to me," I shouted, desperation edging my voice. "You don't know what you're dealing with. We unleashed something that won't let go. If you stay, you're all doomed." The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening, dancing more wildly. The young woman's eyes widened, and she looked at her friends with mounting terror. "I think he's right. This place, it feels wrong." The others hesitated, torn between pride and survival instincts. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of doomed voices pleading and screaming. "Leave now, before it takes you too," I screamed, my voice raw with panic. They moved, driven by something more primal than logic. They gathered their things, the planchette still vibrating with an unseen force, and rushed towards the exit. I followed, every step sinking with the oppressive beat of the malevolent presence around us. Outside, the storm had calmed, but a weight still hung heavy in the air. They stood by their cars, breaths ragged, eyes wide with the realization of their narrow escape. What was that?" the young woman asked, tears streaking down her face. "A cycle of horror," I said, my voice hollow. "It never ends. Get as far away as you can, and never look back." I turned away, the whispers fading into a distant hum as they drove off. Alone, I faced the mansion, understanding the true horror at last. We weren't the first, nor would we be the last. The entity fed off our fear, perpetuating its cycle of torment through lure of curiosity and hubris. And as I walked back to my car, one final whisper echoed through my mind. D-E-E. But I did leave, speeding away from that hellish place with only one resolution, to warn others, to break the cycle if I could. The whispers may follow, but I would refuse to listen. I owed it to Sarah, to Mike, to Rachel and myself, to whoever came next. Title, My Shift on the 8th Floor. The moment the camera on the 8th floor flicked off and then on again, I dismissed it as a glitch. But when it happened 3 more times, I couldn't ignore the cold sense of dread creeping up my spine. What was lurking up there? It was around 2:30 a.m., during one of those graveyard shifts where the hours drag on. I sat in the dimly lit security room, the blue glow of multiple monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cameras covered every corner of the office building, empty hallways, silent stairwells, and motionless office cubicles. Tonight, though, something felt different, more off. I found myself staring at the monitor displaying the 8th floor. The screen flickered again, just for a second, but long enough to catch my attention. I've dealt with these glitches before. They usually meant nothing. But this one sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, and against my better judgment, decided to check it out. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt unusually long, the hum of the machinery a low drone in the background. When the doors slid open, I was hit by a gust of cold air, the kind of cold that seemed unnatural, almost intrusive. The corridor lights were dimmed, shadows pooling in every corner. My footsteps echoed eerily, each step magnifying my sense of solitude. There was a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound somewhere in the distance, too soft to decipher, but enough to set my nerves on edge. As I walked, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping past cubicles and offices. Suddenly I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, heart pounding. It was just a reflection, a bizarre, warped reflection in the large window at the end of the corridor. But it didn't look like me. No, the figure was taller, almost grotesque in its proportions, and for a split second I could have sworn it waved. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it, but every fiber of my being screamed that something wasn't right. The air felt even colder as I approached the end of the corridor. The whispering grew louder, yet more indistinct, like multiple voices layered over one another, creating an oppressive murmur. I reached the server room. The door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. My hand hesitated on the handle, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Inside, the room was darker and colder than the rest of the floor. A monitor was on, which was odd. These systems were never supposed to be powered until morning. Approaching the monitor, I saw the screen filled with lines of garbled text. It looked like meaningless code, or perhaps a malfunction. But right there, among the jumbled characters, was my name repeating over and over, DAVIDTHOMPSON. Every hair on my body stood on end. I backed out of the room, the whispering now a guttural hiss filling my ears. Turning swiftly, I nearly collided with a tall, dark figure standing in the corridor. It wasn't human, more like a shadow, smoke that had taken form. Its face, if you could call it that, was an abyss of nothingness. I blinked and it vanished. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I ran, sprinting back to the elevator, my flashlight bouncing erratically in my hand. I slammed my fist on the button, desperate for the doors to open. When they finally did, I stumbled inside, jabbing the ground floor button repeatedly. The ride down seemed to last an eternity. The lights in the elevator flickered, and I could see my reflection on the metal door. It was twisted, moving unnaturally. Beside me, a tall, dark figure appeared in the reflection, standing still, watching. Cold breath hit my neck. The elevator doors opened with a ding, and I bolted into the lobby, nearly tripping in my panic. My skin was clammy, my breath ragged. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the sight of that dark figure, and the oppressive sense of being watched. I reported the incident to Mark the next morning. He laughed it off, attributing it to sleep deprivation. The cameras, he said, showed nothing unusual. No flickering lights, no figures, nothing. But I knew what I saw, what I felt. Was I losing my mind, or was there something genuinely sinister on that floor? Either way, I resolved to avoid the 8th floor from then on. Yet some nights, I can't shake the feeling that it's just waiting, lurking, and watching for its next visitor. Part 2. My heart was still pounding when I returned to my station. Rational explanations swirled through my mind, but none seemed sufficient. Days turned into nights, and I tried to avoid the 8th floor, running my patrols on autopilot. Yet every now and then, the cold, whispered voices haunted my thoughts. A week later, I was at it again, my curiosity getting the better of me. I found myself drawn back to the floor like a moth to flame. This time, I brought along an extra flashlight and a portable radio, just for my peace of mind. I walked down the corridor again, hearing the faint whispering grow louder as I approached the server room. My breath was shallow and sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the biting cold. I opened the server room door. The monitor was on again, but this time the text was even more incomprehensible. a chaotic mess of symbols and letters. And again, my name stood out amongst the chaos, an ominous repetition that felt personal. Davidcommetous. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The whispering had now turned into an urgent guttural hiss. I swung the flashlight around, and there, standing at the doorway, was the tall, dark figure. I froze, my blood running cold. It moved closer, and with each step, the temperature seemed to plummet further. Adrenaline kicked in, and I pushed past it, feeling a strange, icy resistance as my body passed through where it stood. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing hauntingly behind me. Reaching the elevator, I pounded the button until the doors finally opened. For the next few nights, I stuck to the lower floors, trying to rationalize what I had encountered. My resolve began to waver, and I found it hard to focus on my duties. Seeing Claire during her rounds was a welcome distraction. One late shift, I mentioned the strange occurrences to Claire, trying to keep it casual. She laughed nervously, her eyes darting around the corridor. "Don't joke about stuff like that," she said, shaking her head. "This building is creepy enough at night." I chuckled along, but deep down, her dismissive attitude didn't ease my anxiety. If anything, it made me feel more isolated. She offered a brief moment of normalcy, but as soon as she left, the silence returned, heavier than ever. Later, I decided to confide in Mark. The next morning, I laid out my experiences in detail. His face remained stoic as I recounted my encounters, the flickering lights, the whispers, the dark figure. "David, you know how night shifts can mess with your mind. Maybe you need a break," Mark suggested, his tone gentle but dismissive. "Or some extra rest. There's a perfectly rational explanation for all this." I wanted to believe him, to attribute it all to lack of sleep or overactive imagination. But those encounters felt so real, so immediate. The coldness, the whispers, it wasn't something I could shake off. Mark's reassurance did little to calm the growing knot of fear in my stomach. Several days later, during another patrol, I found myself once again drawn to the 8th floor. The rational part of me screamed to stay away, but something deeper urged me on. This time, I noticed Claire's cleaning cart near the elevator and felt a brief sense of relief. Maybe having someone else around would help dispel the fear. "Hey, Claire!" I called out, my voice echoing in the hallway. She emerged from a cubicle, a welcoming smile on her face. "Need some company up here?" she joked, sensing my unease. "Yeah, the silence is getting to me," I admitted, trying to sound casual. We chatted about mundane things, her kids, my routine, as she cleaned. Her presence was a balm, temporarily easing the oppressive atmosphere. But even as we spoke, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. Claire glanced at her watch, sighing. "Well, I've got to finish up. Stay safe, okay?" She waved and disappeared down the hallway. As her footsteps faded, the familiar coldness crept back in. The sense of being alone hit harder than ever. I glanced down the corridor to where she had just been, wondering if she felt what I did. Or maybe it was just my own paranoia. Resuming my patrol, I took one last look around before heading to the elevator. The whispers seemed to follow, growing louder with each step, each moment feeling more oppressive and inescapable. Part 3. The days turned into a blur of dread and uncertainty. I avoided the 8th floor like the plague, but the unease gnawed at my sanity. My mind was a churning sea of doubt and fear. Sleep eluded me, my restive nights filled with fragments of whispered voices and lurking shadows. One night, exhausted and desperate for clarity, I resolved to confront whatever it was head-on. Armed with my flashlight and a sense of grim determination, I stepped into the 8th floor again. The familiar chill greeted me, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. The dim lights flickered ominously, casting ghostly shadows along the corridor. I moved forward, every footstep a battle against the creeping fear. Suddenly, the corridor behind me went entirely dark. I spun around, flashlight beam barely cutting through the dense blackness. The air grew even colder, almost painfully so. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent. "Mortal," they hissed, the sound seeming to crawl under my skin. I turned back towards the elevator and saw it, the tall, dark figure standing at the far end of the corridor. My heart raced as it began to glide silently toward me, its form shifting and undulating like smoke trapped in a twisted dance. Desperation fueled my actions. I bolted towards the elevator, not daring to look back. Slamming the buttons frantically, the doors slowly began to close. Just as they were about to shut completely, a cold hand touched my shoulder. Gasping, I spun around. The figure was inches away from me. Its face, an abyss of darkness, seemed to devour the very light around it. My breath froze in my lungs, every muscle paralyzed in primal terror. Then, just as suddenly, the doors shut fully and the elevator jolted downward. I collapsed against the wall, my leg muscles weak and trembling. Each floor passed with agonizing slowness, the air around me still frigid, and the faint whisper lingering. As I stumbled out into the lobby, I caught my reflection in the glass entrance doors. I looked pale, exhausted, a shadow of my former self. But behind me, in the glass, the figure loomed, its dark form waiting, watching. Reported the events to Mark once more, my voice shaking with every word. Predictably, he dismissed it again, confirming my isolation and my terror. However, he offered to move me to the day shift, attributing the experiences to the strain of working nights. I took the transfer gratefully, hoping the daylight would erase the haunting memories. But the shadows remained. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, followed, even during the day. The whispers echoed in my thoughts, a constant reminder of the entity lurking on the 8th floor. To find some semblance of peace, I turned to the online community, detailing every harrowing moment. Maybe, just maybe, someone else had seen what I had, felt the same terror. I needed to know I wasn't alone, that this wasn't just my mind unraveling. And now, as I write this, I still wonder if that presence has truly been left behind. It's been quiet, for now. But every creak in the building, every shadow that shifts out of the corner of my eye, it's a reminder. A reminder that perhaps some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Tusher, Part 1, Shadows in the Dark. I've always been a light sleeper. The slightest sound, even a creak, can wake me up. So when Sarah and I moved into our new house, one of the things I looked forward to was the tranquil silence of our suburban street. Little did I know that silence would soon become deafening. It started subtly. One chilly November night around 3 a.m., I woke to a faint noise like a cat meowing. Annoyed, I shuffled to the window, expecting to find a stray. But the street was empty, eerily so. I dismissed it and crawled back into bed, convincing myself it was nothing. A few days later, the noises escalated, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Sarah, ever the skeptic, brushed off my concerns. "It's an old house, Jack," she said. "It's just settling." One night, as the wind howled outside, I awoke again. A rhythmic tapping echoed through the darkness, coming from downstairs. My heart pounded. Each step I took down the staircase felt like a drum beat. With my lamp in hand, I approached the living room window. Then I saw him. In the flash of lightning, a silhouette stood eerily close to the glass. His face was almost pressed against it, eyes fixated on mine. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lamp. "Sarah!" I called out, but my voice was barely a whisper. I dialed 911 with trembling hands. By the time the police arrived, the figure had disappeared. They found no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. Maybe it was a prank, the officer suggested. Somehow, that explanation brought no comfort. My sleep became scarce. Every night, the whispers grew louder, almost taunting. And then I saw him again. It was late, perhaps around midnight. This time, I felt his presence before I saw him. As I crept down the stairs, I saw him standing at the bottom. The lamp cast just enough light to reveal his unnervingly familiar stance. I had seen him before, pressed against the window. This time, his features were more defined, still shadow-clad, but undeniably real. "WHATDOYOUDANT? I don't know how I managed to muster the courage to speak. The figure remained silent, the whispering around him growing louder, morphed into a chilling laugh that seemed to echo inside my very skull. A wave of primal fear washed over me. I stumbled back into the kitchen, where Sarah found me, shaking. Without a word, she dialed the police again. When they arrived, it was the same story, no evidence of anyone. The fear began to consume us, driving a wedge between Sarah and me. Each night was a descent into madness, sleepless and suffused with a sense of impending doom. I knew what I had seen. I knew he was real. But without proof, it was just my word against the silence of our so-called safe haven. One night, as a storm raged outside, I lay wide awake next to Sarah, who had finally started believing me after she also heard the whispers. It was only a matter of time before they returned. That night, something brushed against my arm, waking me instantly. I shot up, eyes darting around the room. Sarah lay beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. And then the whispering began again, louder this time, almost a chant. From downstairs, the rhythmic tapping resumed. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed the lamp and motioned for Sarah to stay put. As I reached the staircase, the front door creaked open on its own. I peered down, my breath catching in my throat. At the bottom of the stairs stood the shadowy figure, taller and more defined than ever. He seemed to blend into the darkness, the whispers now deafening. He wasn't just a silhouette anymore, he was corporeal, menacing. "Whoareyyou?" He didn't respond. The chilling laugh echoed once more, and then, as if mocking my fear, he melted into the shadows. Retreating quickly, I found myself back in the bedroom, Sarah clutching a knife, her eyes frantic. We stayed huddled there until dawn, fear and exhaustion gnawing at our sanity. We couldn't live like this, but we had no choice. The police, kind yet skeptical, couldn't protect us from what they couldn't see or understand. Days turned into weeks, each night blending into the next in a haze of terror and insomnia. Moving was the only option, but could we ever truly escape? The shadows at night and the dread of being watched haunt me to this day. Moving out didn't end our nightmare. It simply changed its form. Even now, whispers persist outside our window, a grim reminder that some horrors transcend understanding. Part 2, The Entity Unveiled. The night Sarah felt something brush against her was a pivotal point. For the first time, she believed every word I had said. We sat in the bedroom, listening to the whispers grow louder and more insistent. This was no figment of my imagination, it was real, and it was coming for us. A few nights later, we were in bed, trying to sleep despite the ever-present dread. Suddenly, a loud crash from the kitchen jolted us awake. Groggy and terrified, we rushed down the stairs. The kitchen was a mess, cupboards open, dishes shattered on the floor. An invisible force had torn through it like a tempest. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah whispered, eyes wide. As we stood there, the temperature dropped rapidly. My breath misted in front of me, and the whispers began anew, swirling around us. I felt something cold and unseen brush my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. We backed away, clutching each other, terrified. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. "Kneelbeforeme." Sarah screamed. I grabbed her hand and we bolted upstairs, slamming the door behind us. There, huddled together, we tried to comprehend what was happening. Rational explanations failed us. This was beyond our understanding. The next night was worse. We barricaded ourselves in our bedroom, hoping to keep the terror at bay. I had called Detective Barnes again, but his skepticism turned to genuine worry as he saw the state we were in. "Stay in tonight," he told me. "We're patrolling the area." It didn't matter. Around midnight, the voices returned, louder, more insistent. Objects in our bedroom started moving. First a picture frame, then a lamp. The whispers grew into a low chant, enveloping us in terror. Sarah and I clung to each other, eyes darting around the room. Then the door handle twisted and the door creaked open as if inviting something in. SHOWYOURSELF. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was, the shadowy figure, no longer just a silhouette but a fully formed entity. His eyes were dark pits, void of any humanity. "STAWAFRMUS," I shouted, my voice cracking. He stepped closer, his form darkening the already dim room. With every step he took, the whispers intensified, echoing around us like a sinister chorus. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at the entity. For a moment, it recoiled, but not for long. It advanced again, faster this time. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed a nearby chair, smashing it against the doorframe to block its path. The entity dissipated into a shadow, leaving behind the same chilling laugh that had haunted my dreams. That was the breaking point. We couldn't endure another night in that house. The next morning we started packing, our movements frantic, driven by the need to escape. But even as we filed boxes into the car, I could feel eyes on me. Invisible hands seemed to tug at my clothes, my hair. Detective Barnes arrived, his face a mask of concern. "You're leaving?" he asked, but it was more of a statement. "We have to," Sarah replied, tears brimming in her eyes. "We can't stay here, not after what happened last night." He nodded solemnly. "I understand. Be safe and keep in touch. Let me know if anything else happens." As we drove away, the house loomed behind us like a dark cloud, haunting our rearview mirrors. I thought escape would bring relief, but deep down, I knew the shadows would follow us. This wasn't over. Even in our new apartment, the faint whispers remained, a constant hum in the background. Every night I felt the same dread, the same sense of being watched. The terror that started in that house had attached itself to us, inescapable and eternal. The shadows, the whispers, and the figure, they left us scarred. Each night as we lay in bed, the chilling realization hits us. The horror didn't stay behind. It traveled with us, a silent, unseen passenger, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Part 3. The haunting continues. Leaving the house behind felt like ripping apart the very fabric of our lives, but we had no choice. The moving van was stuffed with our belongings, the weight of each box a reminder of what we were running from. I hoped the whispers would fade with distance, but deep down, a sickening certainty told me they wouldn't. On our first night in the new apartment, I dared to hope. Sarah and I sat on our couch, the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows. We tried to find comfort in the new surroundings, but the silence felt too familiar. Around midnight, as we lay in bed, I heard it, a faint whisper. My heart sank. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just the wind, but it wasn't. Sarah's breathing hitched, and I knew she heard it too. The next few days were tense but uneventful. We tried to settle in, but the unease never left. One evening, our resolve to ignore the past shattered. We were unpacking boxes in the living room when the lights flickered. The hair on my arms stood on end. The temperature dropped, just like it had before. SARAHKNEELBEFOREME. The voice was unmistakable. It resonated through the room, chilling us to the bone. Sarah's face turned pale as we both realized we hadn't escaped. The entity had followed us. In the days that followed, we couldn't relax. Every corner seemed to harbor shadows. Every rustle held the promise of terror. Sarah became jumpy, her eyes darting towards the windows every few minutes as if expecting the silhouette to reappear. One night I woke to hear Sarah murmuring in her sleep. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent. I shook her awake, but her eyes remained clouded, lost in some terrifying dream. The temperature in the room plummeted. SHEISMINE, the voice filled the room, resonating within the very walls. I grabbed Sarah, trying to pull her out of her trance, but it felt as if some unseen force held her. The whispers grew, overlapping, creating a cacophony of dread. Breaking free from my paralyzing fear, I yanked Sarah towards the door. We stumbled out of the bedroom, the air around us vibrating with malevolence. As we reached the living room, the whispers followed, slithering through the atmosphere. Out of options and driven by sheer desperation, I called out into the darkness, "What do you want? Leave us alone!" The laughter echoed again, a cold, mocking sound. "We must leave," I whispered urgently to Sarah, who nodded in silent terror. We grabbed essentials, abandoning the apartment without a second thought, seeking refuge in a nearby motel. For a while, things seemed to calm down. We stayed in motels, friends' homes, anywhere but our haunted sanctuary. The whispers receded, and a fragile semblance of peace returned. But we couldn't keep running forever. We needed a permanent solution. Despite our fear, we returned to the apartment to pack our remaining belongings. As we crossed the threshold, the familiar chill met us. Shadows danced on the walls, seeming to mock our return. The whispers started, but this time they were different, clearer and more sinister. A tangible malice filled the air, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. We pushed through, hurriedly stuffing our belongings into boxes, every second stretching into an eternity. And then the final message arrived. IAMWATCHINGYOU. It was clearer, louder, and unmistakable. The realization hit us with force. This wasn't bound to a place. It had latched onto us. As we left that apartment for the last time, the weight of the whispers stayed with us. In our new, temporary living arrangement, even the slightest noise sent us into a silent panic. Every night, as we lay in bed, the shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. Our lives have changed irrevocably. The whispers follow us. The feeling of being watched never truly fades. Whether it's a figment of our shared trauma or something more sinister, we may never know. But one thing is certain, we carry the haunting with us, a silent, eternal reminder that some shadows can't be escaped.
It felt like just another game, an adrenaline-fueled thrill, a harmless dabble in the supernatural. But as the cold candlelight flickered in Jake's basement that stormy evening, the whispers from the Ouija board began to grow louder, promising an unsettling night ahead. 10 years ago, I was just 17, chasing shadows with my friends in Jake Summers' old basement. It was the beginning of summer, and a thunderstorm raged outside, making the night perfect for spooky adventures. Jake, the ringleader of our little group, pulled out his aunt's old Ouija board, his face lit with excitement. "Ready to do this?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a mix of thrill and apprehension. Nina Rodriguez, with her long black hair and flowy dress billowing as she moved, gave a nervous chuckle. "As ready as we'll ever be," she replied, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. Paul Fletcher, the skeptic among us, rolled his eyes but joined us at the table anyway. He was tall and athletic, his frame looming over the delicate board. I, Emma Thompson, felt a thrill of fear and curiosity, my fingers tingling as I placed them on the planchette. The basement was a shadowy cave, lit only by the circle of candles Jake had placed around the table. Every flicker of their flames cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Rain hammered against the small, dirt-smeared window, and distant thunder rumbled, setting the perfect stage for our dabbling in the unknown. Jake started with the typical question, his voice hushed. "Is anyone there?" We waited, breaths held, but the planchette remained motionless. Smirking, Paul was about to break the silence when the planchette jerked under our fingertips, moving slowly to yes. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Nina's eyes widened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, more steadily this time, spelling out a name that sent a shiver down our collective spines. "Amarthiel. Amarthiel?" Jake repeated, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "What do you want?" The planchette slid faster now, almost impatiently. "YOU." The air grew colder, our breaths turning to visible puffs of mist. Fear and excitement mingled in the thick, cold air. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. The game had suddenly turned very real. "Should we keep going?" I asked, hearing the tremor in my own voice. "Yeah," Jake said, his determination masking his trepidation. "Let's see what it wants." "When will you leave us alone?" Paul asked, his skepticism starting to waver. The planchette didn't hesitate, spelling out another chilling phrase. WILLNEERLEAVE. That was when the candles flickered, their lights dancing violently before all went out, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled to our feet, bumping into each other, panic rising. "Jake, do something!" Nina cried out, her voice trembling. Jake found a flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal our terrified faces. We were no longer naive teenagers seeking a thrill. We were playthings in the hands of a sinister force. We hastily performed a closing ritual, not really knowing what we were doing, but desperate to end the session. The board remained silent, the planchette still. We left Jake's basement that night, our hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline, convincing ourselves that it was just a game. But deep down, we knew something had changed. The spirit we contacted had left a mark on us, a haunting promise that we couldn't shake off. Years passed, and our little group moved on with life, the memories of that night slowly fading, until now. 10 years later, the whispers started again, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, every echo of the past coming back to haunt us. One night, alone in my apartment, I heard it clearly. A soft, almost familiar whisper. YOUAREMINE. My heart raced as I grabbed the phone, dialing Jake's number. He answered almost immediately, his voice filled with the same dread I felt. "Emma, it's happening again. We need to gather." With that, the stage was set for the final act of our pact with Amarthiel. This time, it felt like there would be no escape. As the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, and a cold, suffocating presence seemed to linger just out of reach. Sleep was out of the question, and the night stretched on endlessly, filled with the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. The following day, I met up with Jake. His once vibrant blue eyes looked hollow, dark circles highlighting his exhaustion. "We have to bring Nina and Paul into this," he said, his voice resolute. Nina was the worst off. She had been in and out of psychiatric care, tormented by visions she refused to describe. When we visited her, her frail form seemed even more fragile. Her eyes darted around the room as if she could see the spirit lingering just outside our view. "It's still here," she murmured, clutching my hand so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. It never left. Paul, who had tried to forget that night with stubborn denial, was reluctantly drawn back into the fold. Despite his initial skepticism, the relentless insomnia he suffered had drained the color from his life. "I thought it was just a game," he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I thought we were just being stupid kids." But the truth was undeniable now. The pact we made 10 years ago had bound us together in a way we never understood, and Amarthiel was coming to collect. That evening, with a sense of grim resignation, we gathered once more in Jake's basement. The atmosphere was oppressively heavy, the air almost electric with anticipation. It felt as if the storm from our past had returned, the howling wind and hammering rain echoing our rising dread. We placed the old Ouija board on the table, our fingers trembling as they touched the dusty planchette. The candles flickered ominously, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out towards us. Taking a deep breath, I asked the question that had haunted us for years. "Is anyone there?" The planchette moved immediately, forcefully, spelling out the response that froze my blood. Y-E-S. The air in the basement grew colder, the shadows lengthening and contorting as if they were alive. Our breaths became visible again, and the reality of our situation hit us like a freight train. We were no longer just playing with the supernatural. We were confronting a nightmare that had been waiting for a decade. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his fear. The planchette moved so quickly it was hard to keep up. Y-O-U. And with that, the true horror of our situation became clear. This was no longer a game. It was a reckoning. The spirit we had summoned was here to claim what we had unknowingly promised. The candles flickered violently before snuffing out, plunging the room into an oppressive darkness. In the silence, we heard Nina start to sob, her fragile mental state unraveling further under the pressure. We scrambled for the flashlight, and when Jake finally managed to click it on, the beam cut through the darkness to reveal our terrified faces. The pact had come back to haunt us, and this time, we couldn't run away. The spirit had been patient, it had waited, and now it was time to collect. The real terror was just beginning. We knew we had to talk to Nina, as her torment had always seemed the most severe. The next day, Jake, Paul, and I drove to the psychiatric facility where Nina had been staying. The facility was bleak, its stark white walls and sterile halls amplifying the sense of despair. When we entered Nina's room, the sight of her frail form was heartbreaking. Her once lustrous black hair was now lifeless and tangled, her olive skin pale against the white sheets. She looked up at us with dark, haunted eyes, her hands trembling. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew you would." "Nina, we need to know what you've been seeing," I said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "We need your help to understand what's happening." She held my hand tightly, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so weak. "It's always there," she murmured, watching, whispering. "It won't leave us alone." Jake leaned in, his voice gentle but urgent. "Nina, what did it say? What did Amarthiel tell you?" She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He wants us. He wants our souls for the pact. We have to go back to the basement. It's the only way." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. The basement. The place where it all began, and the place where it would all end. We had no choice. We had to confront Amarthiel and face the consequences of our actions. We brought Nina back to Jake's house, supporting her frail form as we descended into the basement. The air was colder than ever, an icy chill that seeped into our bones. The Ouija board was still on the table, the planchette waiting, almost as if it knew we would return. As we gathered around the table, Nina's eyes darted nervously around the room. "He's here," she whispered. "I can feel him." The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a word that made my blood run cold. P-A-C-T. What does that mean? Paul asked, his voice shaking. What is this pact? The planchette continued to move, spelling out another chilling message. B-I-N-D. Nina started to tremble, her eyes rolling back as she screamed, "No, no, please leave us alone." Jake and I held her down, trying to keep her calm, but the temperature in the room dropped even further. Our breaths were visible, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow, creeping closer. "We need to know what he wants," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over Nina's screams. The planchette moved with frightening speed, spelling out a final message. Y-O-U-R-T-I-E-I-S-U-P. Suddenly, the room went silent, the candles snuffed out, and we were plunged into darkness once more. Jake's flashlight cut through the gloom, but the beam flickered uncertainly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Nina stopped screaming, her body going limp in our arms. "He's here," she whispered, her voice a faint echo. "He's come to collect." A cold wind swept through the basement, and the sense of dread became almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe as if they had a life of their own. I felt something brush against my skin, a touch as cold as death. We were not alone in the basement. Amarthiel was with us, and he was ready to claim what he believed was his. Jake tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles white. "What do we do, Emma? How do we stop this?" "We can't run," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my heart. "We have to face him. We need to know the truth about the pact." We placed our hands back on the planchette, our fingers trembling. The Ouija board began to move again, spelling out a message that would seal our fate. G-I-V-E-U-P and Y-O-U-W-I-L-L-I-V-E. We exchanged a look of horror. Amarthiel was offering us a chance to end this nightmare, but the price was too high. Our lives were bound to the pact, and surrendering meant losing everything we had ever known. "I won't give up," Jake said defiantly, his voice rising above the whispers that filled the room. "We'll find a way to break the pact." But as the planchette moved one final time, spelling out a word that sent a shiver down our spines, I realized with growing terror that there might be no way out. D-E-A-T-H. The shadows surged forward, enveloping us in a suffocating darkness. Nina's screams echoed in my ears as the world around me seemed to blur and distort. The last thing I saw was the planchette, moving on its own, mocking us with a sinister clarity. We were trapped, bound by a promise we never fully understood. And now, the spirit we had summoned 10 years ago was ready to collect its due. The oppressive darkness was suffocating, and I struggled to maintain my grip on reality. The air was so thick with cold that I could barely breathe. Nina's screams had subsided into haunting echoes, leaving the basement eerily silent. Jake's flashlight flickered and then died, plunging us into absolute darkness. "We need to find the candles," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, filled with determination and fear. I fumbled blindly in the dark, my hands trembling as I searched for a match. My fingers brushed against the rough texture of the matchbox, and I quickly struck a match, the small flame casting an ephemeral circle of light around us. We managed to light the candles, their flickering flames barely holding back the darkness. Nina remained motionless, her eyes vacant as we huddled around the table. Paul, usually so composed, was visibly shaking. "What do we do now?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I picked up the voice recorder, my fingers shaking, and spoke into it in a trembling voice. "We're here in Jake's basement, trying to confront the spirit of Amarthiel. We've just received a message that our time is up. If anyone listens to this, know that we tried to break the pact, but the spirit is powerful. We can't seem to escape it." As I set down the recorder, a sudden bone-chilling wind blew through the basement, extinguishing the candles once more. We were plunged back into darkness, but this time an icy hand gripped my wrist. I gasped, feeling the cold seep into my bones. "He's here," Nina whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. "He's going to take us." Jake's voice cut through the fear. "We need to stand together. We can't let him take us one by one." Just as he finished speaking, the darkness seemed to come alive. Shadows crept along the walls, extending ethereal tendrils that wrapped around Jake's leg. He struggled, trying to kick them off, but they held firm. "I won't let him take me," he shouted, desperation coloring his voice. In a moment of panic, Paul ran towards the basement stairs, but as he reached the steps, something yanked him back into the shadows. His scream was abruptly cut off, leaving only a chilling silence. With Jake fighting the shadows and Paul taken, I knew I was next. The air grew colder, and I could feel the malevolent presence closing in. I reached out, grabbing hold of Jake's hand. "We have to do this together," I yelled, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake nodded, his face set in a grim determination. "Emma, whatever happens, don't give up." We both placed our free hands back on the planchette, the one link we had to the spirit. The board moved once more, slowly, deliberately, spelling out a final message, SOULSMIN. The darkness surged forward, wrapping around us like a cloak. Jake's hand was ripped from mine, and his fading scream reverberated through the basement. I felt myself being pulled into the cold void, my grip on reality slipping. In the final moments, I managed to grab the voice recorder and spoke into it with my last ounce of strength. "I'm Emma Thompson. We tried to break free, but Amarthiel is too strong. This is not a game. If you find this recording, please don't make the same mistake." As my consciousness faded, I felt the icy grip tighten around me. The last thing I saw was the flickering light of the recorder, then nothing but darkness. I finished my tale, staring into the empty basement, realizing I was entirely alone. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, the silence more deafening than any scream. I could feel the cold breath of the spirit on my neck, but I refused to give in to the fear. For now, I had to leave this record as a warning. With shaking hands, I set the voice recorder on the table and whispered, "This is Emma Thompson's final warning. He's still here, and he's coming for you." I stood slowly, feeling the presence looming over me. Step by step, I made my way up the basement stairs, each creak underfoot echoing like a death knell. As I reached the top, I turned back one last time. The basement was a void of darkness, and I knew in my heart that I would never truly escape. But maybe, just maybe, someone could learn from our folly and avoid the fate that awaited us. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the final chilling whisper of Amarthiel, ORENEXT. Terrified but resolved, I left the house, knowing that my story was no longer just a memory. It was a dire warning.
The whispers between. The old Ouija board sat in the corner of my attic for years, gathering dust and whispers. I never thought much of it until the night my sister disappeared. That's when the nightmares started, and the board began to call to me. I'd always been skeptical of the supernatural, but desperation has a way of changing your beliefs. 3 months had passed since Lily vanished without a trace, leaving behind a grieving fiancé and a string of unanswered questions. The police had exhausted every lead, and our parents had all but given up hope. But I couldn't let go. I needed answers, even if they came from an unlikely source. The board was heavier than I expected as I carried it down to the living room. Its wood was dark with age, the letters and numbers faded but still visible. I hesitated before setting it on the coffee table, my fingers tracing the ornate yes and no in the corners. This was crazy, right? But what did I have to lose? I placed my fingertips on the planchette, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes. "Lily," I whispered, "are you there?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly I felt the planchette begin to move. My eyes snapped open, watching in disbelief as it glided across the board. HELO, my heart raced. Was this real? Was I moving it subconsciously? "Lily, is that you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved again, more quickly this time. NOTLILY, a chill ran down my spine. If it wasn't Lily, then who or what was I talking to? "Who are you?" I demanded. BETWEEN. Between what? WORLDS, I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to yank my hands away from the planchette. "Do you know what happened to my sister?" "Yes, tell me." The planchette began to move erratically, spelling out a jumble of letters that made no sense. Just as I was about to give up, it suddenly stilled, then spelled out a clear message. SHETEEPEDTTHROUGH. Step through what? I asked, leaning closer to the board. THEVEIL. My phone rang, startling me so badly I knocked the board to the floor. It was Jake, Lily's fiancé. I answered with shaking hands. "You need to come over," he said, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't place. "Now." 20 minutes later, I was standing in Jake's living room, staring at a sight that made my blood run cold. The wallpaper had been torn away, revealing a hidden door I never knew existed. But it was what lay beyond the door that turned my world upside down. A swirling vortex of darkness pulsed within the frame, tendrils of shadow reaching out as if alive. And there, hovering at its edge, was a familiar silhouette. "Lily?" I whispered, taking a step forward. She turned, and I gasped. It was my sister, but not as I remembered her. Her eyes were pitch black, her skin pale and translucent. When she spoke, her voice echoed as if coming from a great distance. "Emily," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "You shouldn't have come." Jake stood beside me, his face a mask of guilt and fear. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't know what else to do. She won't come back, and I can't go in there." "What is this place?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away from the writhing darkness. Lily's ethereal form drifted closer to the doorway. "It's the space between worlds," she explained. "I found it by accident, hidden behind the wall. I was curious, and I stepped through." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The Ouija board hadn't been lying. Lily had literally stepped through a veil between our world and something else. "Can't you come back?" I pleaded, reaching out to her. She shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. This place, it changes you. The longer you stay, the less human you become. I've seen things, Emily. Incredible, terrifying things. But I can't leave. Not anymore." Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. "There has to be a way," I insisted. "We can find someone to help, a medium or—" "No!" Lily's shout echoed unnaturally, causing the vortex behind her to pulse violently. "You can't tell anyone about this. The veil is thin here, but it exists everywhere. If people knew, if they started looking for these doorways." She shuddered, her form flickering. "You have no idea what horrors lie on the other side, waiting for a chance to break through." Jake let out a choked sob. "I've been trying to find a way to bring her back for months," he confessed. "But every time I get close to the doorway, I hear whispers, promises, threats. It's maddening." I thought back to the Ouija board, to the entity that had spoken to me. Had it been trying to warn me or lure me in? Lily's form began to fade, drawn back towards the swirling vortex. "You have to seal this doorway," she said urgently. "Cover it up. Destroy it if you have to. And Emily?" Her eyes for a moment seemed to clear, a flash of the sister I knew shining through. "Get rid of that Ouija board. Some connections are better left severed." With a final sad smile, she vanished into the darkness. The vortex pulsed once, twice, and then began to shrink. Jake and I spent the next hour boarding up the doorway, working in silence as we processed the impossible truth we'd discovered. When we were done, he turned to me, his eyes hollow with grief. "What do we tell people?" he asked. I thought of the Ouija board waiting in my living room, of the entity that lived between worlds. I thought of my sister, lost to a realm we couldn't comprehend. And I made a decision. "Nothing," I said firmly. "We tell them nothing." That night, I burned the Ouija board in my backyard, watching as the flames consumed the ancient wood. As the smoke curled up into the starry sky, I swore I heard a whisper on the wind, a thank you, or perhaps a warning. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. But that doesn't mean we have to keep listening for what lies on the other side. As I watched the last embers fade, I silently said goodbye to Lily and to the mysteries of the spaces between worlds. Sometimes, not knowing is the only way to stay sane. It was a night I will never forget. Remember the night you mocked the spirits? It's a question etched into my mind, a reminder of our foolishness. The spirits were still listening, they were waiting, and now they've come for us, one by one. It's strange how clear my memories are from that night, considering the fear and chaos that followed. Emily had called me and Marco over to her grandmother's house, the old mansion known for its mysterious aura. When we arrived, she led us up a creaky staircase to the attic, where she'd discovered something intriguing amidst the dust-covered relics, an old Ouija board. "Check this out," Emily said excitedly, her blue eyes sparkling under the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the low ceiling. "Seriously?" I replied, rolling my eyes. "You really believe in this stuff?" Emily shrugged, her auburn curls bouncing slightly. It's just for fun, Jamie. Come on, don't be such a skeptic. Marco, always up for something new, clapped me on the back. Relax, man. Let's just see what happens, he said, his dimpled smile not hiding his nervous energy. We gathered around the board, a dusty relic with faded letters and numbers. An uneasy silence filled the attic as we placed our fingers on the planchette. The room's damp, musty air seemed to close in on us. If there are any spirits here, make your presence known, Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move. I watched, my skepticism fighting against the chill creeping up my spine. It moved slowly at first, spelling out a series of letters that made no sense. We exchanged nervous glances, and then it stopped on the letter E. Okay, who's messing with us? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. It wasn't me, Marco said, his wide eyes betraying his fear. The planchette moved again, spelling more letters. E-L-I-A-S-I-S-E-R-E. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the oppressive silence returned. That's not funny, I muttered. I didn't know why, but deep down I felt that I had to defy it. Prove you're here, I demanded, my voice a bit shakier than I intended. The response was almost immediate. A loud crash echoed from the dark corner of the attic. We jumped, hearts pounding, eyes straining to see through the shadows. The single bulb flickered ominously. What was that? Emily whispered, clutching Marco's arm. None of us dared to move. The silence felt like it was pressing in on us from all sides, as if the attic itself was holding its breath. A faint whispering sound started to permeate the room, growing louder and more agitated. We decided then that it was best to put the board away. As we hurried to leave the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Emily, Marco, and I exchanged forced laughs, trying to shake off the fear as we descended the creaky stairs. But none of us mentioned what the board had spelled out. A few days later, small things started to happen. It began with minor, easily dismissible events. The creaking of floorboards in our homes, cold drafts on otherwise warm days, familiar smells from the past suddenly filling a room. One evening, Emily called us over again. We sat in her backyard, the chilled autumn air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. She looked visibly shaken. Guys, remember what the board said? The name? She asked, her voice unsteady. Marco and I nodded. I've been having these dreams, Emily continued. In them, there's a man I've never seen before. He stands in the shadows and just watches. I tried to rationalize it. It's just your mind playing tricks. We've been on edge since that night. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. Came home one evening to find every light in my house flickering. Marco's usually strong and cheerful demeanor had begun to crack. He started avoiding his basement altogether, convinced he could hear someone whispering his name from below. I swear I saw something move in my room last night, Marco confided during one of our meetings. I know it sounds crazy, but it was there, Jamie. I know it was. Despite my initial skepticism, the evidence was mounting. One night as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached my door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and then, nothing. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. I had to investigate. As I approached the doorknob began to turn. Half in terror and half in a desperate need to know, I yanked the door open. There was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I backed away slowly, my mind racing to rationalize what I just experienced. The spirit's presence was undeniable now. It was no longer just a series of coincidences. It was real, and it was with us. The name Elias echoed in my thoughts, a dark reminder of what we had unleashed. It wasn't long before we found out just how much danger we were in. A deep, pervasive chill settled into my bones following that night. It was as if the very air around us had changed, charged with an uncomfortable heaviness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Emily called us over again. Her eyes were tired, underscored with dark circles, and her normally vibrant demeanor had dulled. We gathered in her attic once more, unable to shake the compulsion to confront what we had released. We need to find out what it wants, she said, her voice breaking. A sense of dread washed over me, but I concurred. We set up the board under the flickering light once more. Spirit, what do you want from us? Emily asked, almost pleading. The planchette moved immediately. WARNINGBLOOOD Marco's face went pale. Emily trembled and clung to the table. The full moon, she muttered, her voice barely audible. It's tomorrow night. Desperation clawed at me. We should stop. This is getting too real, I said, my voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. The next night, a full moon lit the sky, casting eerie shadows in Emily's attic. She couldn't sleep and kept hearing noises. Her younger brother, curious and unaware, had ventured into the attic. When morning came, he didn't. We found her brother's lifeless body in the attic, his eyes wide open but vacant, as though something had sucked the life out of him. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries. He simply ceased to be. The police arrived, flashing lights and curious neighbors, but they found no answers. The family was shattered, and Emily was inconsolable. We were haunted not just by the memories of what happened, but by our role in the horror unfolding around us. The once tight-knit bond among us began to fray. Emily withdrew, consumed by grief and guilt, while Marco became paranoid, convinced that something malevolent was following him. As for me, my once firm disbelief in the supernatural crumbled beneath the weight of the undeniable. Supernatural occurrences escalated. Objects in our homes moved on their own, doors slammed without reason, and cold spots materialized in otherwise warm rooms. Each night I heard whispers, soft, hissing voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They repeated the same phrase, driving me to the brink of madness. REMMBERTHEPACT. One night, a particularly cold draft woke me from a restless sleep. As I sat up, I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room, shrouded in darkness. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. I blinked and the figure was gone. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight I had felt before. Marco, too, was suffering. He started missing classes, and his carefree demeanor vanished. When I visited him, his room was in disarray, and he looked gaunt and haunted. "It won't leave me alone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I hear it calling my name at night. It's getting closer, Jamie. I don't know what to do." A cold knot twisted in my stomach. We were beyond simple explanations or rational solutions. There was a profound, terrifying truth we had to face. And it became undeniable the night Marco went missing. He had been in his dorm room. His roommate heard strange noises and called the campus police. They found the room empty, with claw marks on the walls, as though Marco had tried to resist being taken. Despair settled over me. Emily began experiencing horrific visions at night, shadowy figures reaching out to her, whispering threats and promises of doom. We couldn't run from it. We couldn't hide. Our only chance, I realized, was to confront the spirit and understand the pact. We were bound to it, and it was claiming what we had unknowingly promised, our souls. I had to find a way to break the hold it had on us before it was too late. With a sinking heart and a mind teetering on the edge of sanity, I prepared to face the malevolent force that had turned our lives into a living nightmare. One particularly cold night, I decided to dig deeper into the name Elias and the pact we had foolishly made. The town library became my refuge. Its dusty records and ancient books were a well of knowledge. Through hours of tireless research, I pieced together a harrowing story. Elias had been a malevolent spirit, summoned long ago by desperate townsfolk seeking to foretell their future. They made a pact with him, offering their souls for glimpses of what lay ahead. Elias kept his promises, but he twisted their fates in the darkest ways, claiming their lives one by one. My heart pounded as the truth sank in. We had repeated the mistakes of the past, bound to a spirit that thrived on fear and death. I had to warn Emily, but when I reached out, she didn't answer. I rushed to her house, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Emily's front door was ajar. The house was eerily silent as I made my way upstairs to her room. I found her sitting on her bed, eyes empty and fixed on the corner where a shadow loomed ominously. "Emily, snap out of it," I shouted, shaking her. She blinked, snapping back to reality, her eyes widening with terror. "It's here," she whispered. "It won't leave me alone." I grabbed her hand, desperation in my voice. "We have to end this, Emily. We need to confront it and break the pact." The room grew colder, and a low, guttural whisper filled the air. REEMBERTEPACT. The shadow in the corner began to take shape, morphing into a visage that was both human and monstrous. It was Elias, the spirit we had summoned, now fully manifest and hungering for our souls. "Why do you haunt us?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The spirit's eyes glowed with malevolent glee, and it answered in a voice that resonated with ancient evil. "Why? OURSOULS. I glanced at Emily, her face pale and filled with despair. But there was something else. Determination. Together we faced the entity, standing our ground. "We reject you," Emily said, her voice surprisingly strong. "We will not give in to your terror." A fierce wind swept through the room, and the spirit roared in anger. The temperature dropped further, and it felt as though the very air was being sucked out of the room. The shadows grew longer, pressing in on us from all sides. I held up the Ouija board, now our only connection to this nightmare. "You have no power here. The pact is broken." My voice echoed, and for a moment the spirit hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I could feel the tension in the air. With a final, defiant roar, the spirit lunged at us, but a blinding light burst forth from the Ouija board, enveloping the room. The spirit screamed, a sound that reverberated with centuries of anguish, before it was pulled back into the board, which shattered into pieces. The oppressive weight lifted immediately, and the cold dissipated. Emily and I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. The nightmare was finally over. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The haunting ceased, and the oppressive fear that had hung over us like a dark cloud was gone. Emily and I remained close, bound by the harrowing experience we had survived together. Marco's whereabouts remained a mystery, a somber reminder of the price we had paid. His loss weighed heavily on us, but we found solace in the fact that the spirit of Elias was no longer lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim our souls. In the end, we learned a valuable lesson. Some doors once opened cannot easily be closed. Our curiosity had unleashed a darkness we were ill-prepared to face, and it was only through sheer will and determination that we survived. Now, as I sit by the flickering fire and recount this tale, I hope it serves as a warning. Be careful what you seek, for the answers you find may not be worth the price you pay. Have you ever felt eyes on you, even when you're sure you're alone? That haunting sensation started the night I knocked on the door of Unit 5B to welcome my new neighbor. Little did I know, Vincent was no ordinary tenant, and I was about to uncover a chilling truth that would shatter my understanding of reality. I had just moved into this apartment complex last month, seeking a fresh start after a brutal breakup. It wasn't anything fancy, but it suited my needs. Quiet, decent rent, and close enough to work. Besides, I was optimistic about the change, figuring a new environment might help me get back on my feet. The first sign of trouble came through the building's management app. I got a notification that read, "New neighbor in 5B." I should have felt indifferent. People come and go all the time. But there was something about it that set me on edge, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. That evening, after a long day filled with troubleshooting computer systems and dealing with irate clients, I decided to pay a visit to the new tenant. I had always believed in being friendly, even if I viewed myself as a bit of an introvert. I knocked on the door and waited. An unsettlingly long pause followed before I heard the slow, deliberate sound of locks being undone. The door creaked open, and there stood Vincent. He was a man in his mid-40s, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to look right through me. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hair was short, slicked back in a manner that felt out of place for someone who just moved in. He looked at me without a word, his expression unreadable. "Hi, I'm Jordan, your neighbor from 5A, I said, forcing a smile. "Just wanted to welcome you to the building." Vincent nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "Thank you," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Name's Vincent." The silence that followed was suffocating, and his unblinking stare made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I mumbled something about being around if he needed anything, and hurried back to my apartment, my mind reeling from the discomfort of the encounter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling an inexplicable unease. Was it Vincent, or was it just the stress of the move and my recent breakup gnawing at me? I didn't know, and I tried convincing myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint noise. I sat up, trying to pinpoint its source. It sounded like whispers, but it was unclear, almost as if the walls themselves were murmuring secrets. I strained my ears, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. Groggily, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I noticed my keys weren't on the counter where I usually left them. My heart skipped a beat. They were in the bathroom cabinet instead. Maybe I had misplaced them, but it felt off, like a small piece of a larger, more menacing puzzle. The following morning, I tried to dismiss the incident, chalking it up to my exhaustion. But as the days passed, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. I would hear the whispers more frequently and find objects inexplicably moved. A framed photo of my family, sturdy on the wall, crashed to the ground, glass shards scattering across the floor. Then, late one night, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping. My curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole, my heart pounding. In the dim corridor, I saw Vincent, dragging a heavy bag that left a dark, wet trail behind it. The sight was both horrifying and mesmerizing, a slow-motion nightmare. Against my rational instincts, I followed him. The dimly lit hallway led to the basement, a place I had rarely explored. Vincent moved with purpose, oblivious to my presence. He reached a rusted metal door at the far end, opening it to reveal an abyss of darkness. A rancid smell hit me, a sickening blend of rot and decay. I hid behind a stack of old boxes, my heart hammering in my chest. Vincent dragged the bag into the room, leaving the door ajar. I could hear the wet squelch of whatever was inside, accompanied by the sound of buzzing flies. The stench was overwhelming, nearly making me gag. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept closer, peering into the room. What I saw sent a jolt of terror through me. The walls were smeared with crimson symbols, their meanings unknown but undeniably sinister. In the center of the room stood a makeshift altar, adorned with bones and tattered remains. It looked like the site of an ancient, malevolent ritual. A hand suddenly gripped my shoulder, and I turned to face Vincent's enraged eyes inches from mine. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "I-T-S-H-A-T-T-E-R-E-D-Y-O-U-R-U-N-D-E-R-S-T-A-N-D-I-N-F-R-E-A-L-I-T-Y." The words echoed in my mind as I sprinted back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night barricading it with furniture, trembling with a fear that refused to dissipate. The following morning, the sunlight filtering through my blinds did little to dispel the dread clinging to me. I could still feel Vincent's grip on my shoulder, his rage palpable as if he stood right behind me. My threshold for normalcy had been shattered, and I knew I wasn't dealing with anything ordinary. Days went by in a haze. I avoided Vincent, but the unsettling occurrences in my apartment continued. Whispers at odd hours, objects moving without explanation. It was as though my reality was bending, twisting into something unrecognizable. Then, one night, it reached a peak. I woke up in the dead of night, again to the sound of scraping metal. My heart pounded as I peeked through the peephole. Vincent, with the same heavy bag, was dragging it toward the basement. The dark trail behind him was even more prominent this time, a grotesque breadcrumb trail. Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, I dressed quickly and followed him, maintaining a safe distance. He seemed oblivious to my presence, focused on his grim task. I watched him unlock the rusted door to that vile room, noting the way he moved, almost ritualistic, like he was performing some dark rite. Once Vincent disappeared into the darkness, I resolved to get closer. I needed to know what was in that bag. Holding my breath, I crept up to the door, the rancid smell even more overpowering than before. I squinted into the dim light, trying to make sense of the scene inside. The bag lay open on the floor, its contents a mass of rotting flesh and bones. My stomach churned, bile rising as I forced myself to look around. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a macabre life of their own. The altar was more intricate now, adorned with fresh bones and what looked like animal sacrificial remnants. My pulse raced. I had to get out of there before Vincent realized I was spying on him. Just as I turned to leave, a hand clamped down on my shoulder again. I whipped around to see Vincent's face, contorted with fury, mere inches from mine. His breath was hot, and his eyes bore into mine, making my blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here," he spat, his voice dripping with malevolence. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I broke free, sprinting down the corridor. I could hear Vincent's footsteps hard on my heels, his breathing heavy with rage. My feet pounded against the cold floor, my lungs burning with the effort of escape. Just as I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I threw furniture against it, creating a makeshift barricade. My heart hammered in my chest, the fear morphing into pure terror as I heard Vincent's muffled voice outside, whispering sinister threats. "Y-O-U-R-E-N-E-X-T." Those words echoed in my head as I curled up on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife for whatever comfort it could provide. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified Vincent might break in. Morning brought an eerie calm. The sinister whispers were gone. Mustering every ounce of resolve, I checked the peephole. Nothing. I cautiously moved the furniture away from the door, half expecting Vincent to come, crashing in. But when I dared to open it and look out, the hallway was empty. Only silence greeted me. The next day, I ventured outside to clear my head. I needed to talk to the building manager. Someone had to know something about Vincent and what was happening in Unit 5B. I approached the front desk, trying to mask my desperation. "Hey, I need to talk to you about the guy in Unit 5B, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The manager, a middle-aged woman with an air of indifference, looked puzzled. "There's no one in Unit 5B, she replied, scanning through her computer. "We haven't had a tenant there for months. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" My blood ran cold. "What? No, I met him. Vincent. He's been there for weeks." She shook her head firmly. "I can assure you that unit's been vacant. Maintenance is scheduled to clean it out next week." Disbelief washed over me. How could Vincent vanish so completely, leaving no trace behind? My mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of this increasingly horrifying puzzle. Had I imagined it all? No, that couldn't be. It was too real, too visceral. Determined to find answers, I decided to investigate the basement once more. I needed to know if the dark room and its horrifying contents were still there. The rational side of my mind screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. Not now. I descended the stairwell, my footsteps echoing ominously. The corridor seemed longer this time, each step filled with dread. As I reached the rusted door, I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The stench had dissipated. The room was empty, save for dust-covered boxes and old furniture. No symbols, no altar, no remains, nothing. It was as if the room had never harbored those horrors, erasing any evidence of the nightmare I knew I had seen. Desperation clawed at me as I stood there, the cold, mundane reality of the basement pressing in on me. My mind felt fractured, teetering on the brink of disbelief. I stumbled back to my apartment, each step heavier than the last. That night, sleep eluded me once more. My thoughts were a chaotic whirlpool. Vincent's piercing eyes, the ghastly room, the chilling whispers. I was losing my grasp on normalcy, haunted by the inescapable feeling that Vincent was still watching somewhere in the shadows. In a last-ditch effort to make sense of it all, I typed out my experience on Reddit, hoping someone might believe me, might understand what I'd been through. My fingers flew over the keyboard, the words tumbling out in a frantic stream. "Please, if you ever get a new neighbor in Unit 5B, be careful. And whatever you do, stay out of the basement." Hitting the post button, I leaned back, feeling a semblance of release. Perhaps sharing my story could help me piece together the shattered remains of my sanity. And maybe, just maybe, it would prevent someone else from experiencing the same terror. The next morning, the unease that had haunted me took on a new form, one of resolute determination. I needed answers, even if it meant confronting my deepest fears. I decided to venture back to the basement one final time. As I descended the stairs, an oppressive silence pressed in around me. Reaching the rusted door, I hesitated, memories of the horrors I'd seen making my pulse race. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. But it looked different in the harsh light of day, ordinary, benign. The symbols, the altar, the grotesque remains were gone. It was just a forgotten storage room once more. Confusion and fear twisted inside me. Had I lost my mind? Was Vincent even real? I moved further in, scanning every shadowed corner, every inch of the walls. Nothing. There was no trace of the sinister tableau I'd witnessed. The bile rose in my throat as I heard a faint whisper echoing in my mind, a reminder of the horrors that kept unfolding the deeper I went. DONOTTRUSTWHTYOUSEE. The words pulsed in my head, as if Vincent himself were speaking directly into my mind. Unease morphed into a chilling certainty. I wasn't alone. I scrambled out of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't shake the feeling that some unseen force was watching, stalking me. By the time I reached my apartment, I was trembling. I couldn't live like this. I decided to pack my things. I needed to leave, escape this nightmare. But even as I packed, my mind kept drifting back to the idea of posting my experience on Reddit. Maybe there, in the vast expanse of the internet, someone would believe me, maybe even help me make sense of it all. I knew it sounded crazy, but I had to try. Sitting down at my computer, I recounted everything. The eerie encounter with Vincent, the whispers, the unsettling sights in the basement, all of it. Typing, my hands shook, but I didn't stop until the last word was written. Have you ever felt eyes on you, even when you're sure you're alone? My neighbor in Unit 5B was no ordinary tenant. Please, if you ever get a new neighbor in 5B, be careful. And whatever you do, stay out of the basement. I hit post, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. As the screen refreshed, I saw the responses start to pour in, some sympathetic, others skeptical, and a few who had experienced similar things. Their stories echoed mine, chilling in their familiarity. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my reverie. It was a message from Sarah Livingston, a journalist who happened to see my post. She wanted to meet, claiming she had information about the building and previous tenants of Unit 5B. We agreed to meet in a nearby cafe. Sarah was punctual, blonde hair framing her inquisitive green eyes. She seemed professional yet approachable, a reassuring presence in my frazzled state. Jordan, I'm investigating strange occurrences in this building, she said, cutting straight to the point. You're not the first to experience this. Every tenant who lived in 5B either vanished or moved away suddenly, leaving no trace of their stay. What do you mean? I asked, curiosity and fear warring inside me. Vincent isn't real, not in the way you think. He's a manifestation, perhaps the building's dark history given form. Every few months he reappears, repeating the cycle, driving people to madness. Her words hit me like a hammer. The memories of Vincent's piercing gaze, his cold touch, they weren't the delusions of a deteriorating mind. They were echoes of something much darker, something no one should have to endure. How do we stop it? My voice trembled, desperation seeping through. She shook her head. I don't know if we can stop it, but we need to document it, bring it to light. If enough people know, maybe the power it holds will weaken. I returned to my apartment with a new purpose, my fear now tempered by determination. I needed to find any remaining evidence, anything to corroborate my experiences. I ventured back to the basement, Sarah by my side, armed with her camera and recorder. As we descended, I heard the whispers again, louder this time, resonating with an almost palpable malice. We reached the rusted door, and Sarah flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty, just as before. Sarah's face fell, the lack of physical proof a blow to our cause. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. I reached for my phone to record the whispers, but as I did, the lights flickered and the temperature plummeted. A chill ran down my spine as the whispers coalesced into a single, unmistakable phrase. Leavenow. Panic surged through me. We bolted, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the well-lit hallway. The feeling of eyes watching us, unseen and malevolent, never left. Sarah and I parted ways, her promising to investigate further, me feeling a strange mixture of hope and hopelessness. I packed my things more urgently now, ready to leave this nightmare behind. As I waited for the moving truck, I read through the supportive comments and the stories of others who had experienced similar horrors, reinforcing my resolve. Despite the fear, despite the doubt, sharing my story was the only way to fight back, to weaken the hold that Vincent, or whatever force he represented, had on this place. To anyone reading this, trust your instincts. If you ever move into an apartment and hear of someone new in Unit 5B, be wary, and whatever you do, stay out of the basement. As the last box was loaded and I took one final look at the building, A movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze. Turning slowly, I saw a dark figure standing at a distant window, watching. Vincent. I shivered, the memory of his piercing eyes etched into my soul as I drove away, leaving the building and its horrors behind. But the fear never truly left me. A constant reminder that some evils are not meant to be understood, only survived.